The air in Vorthos was perpetual twilight, a heavy velvet-red gloom that smelled of ancient stone and faint, metallic decay. It was a beautiful hell, Kale Ryder thought, and now it was his cage. He stood in the massive echoing hall of the Crimson Cathedral, the floor a dark obsidian mirror reflecting the 1,000 flickering candles. These were not the gentle beeswax lights of his home Viridia. These were tall, cold pillars of flame, casting dancing shadows that made the stone gargoyles seem alive. He wore the ceremonial robes given to him, deep burgundy and black velvet, heavy and hot. They were fine, but they felt like a costume, a mockery. The vampires surrounding him were dressed in armor that gleamed with cold malice or robes that flowed like spilt blood. Their faces were carved from marble, their eyes glowing with an inner, predatory light. And they hated him. Kale was the only human present. He was the offering. The great oak doors groaned open, silencing the low, sibilant whispers of the court. The air turned impossibly cold as if a grave had opened. Ilara Kalen, the new sovereign of Vorthos, entered. She did not walk, she glided, a vision of lethal majesty that stole Kale's breath, not in admiration but in stark, paralyzing terror. She was taller than him even without the spiky, high-backed boots. Her armor was a masterpiece of black, jagged plates that seemed to grow from her skin, highlighting a figure of impossible, cruel beauty. Her crown was a circlet of iron thorns and ruby spikes. Her eyes, fixed somewhere above Kale's head, were molten crimson. She was the Warbride, the one who had personally led the charge that crushed Kale's homeland. She was the reason the war was over, and the reason Kale was standing here, offering his life for a temporary peace. She stopped 2 feet from him, and the heat radiating off Kale's body seemed to shrivel under the sheer icy power of her presence. Kale Ryder. Her voice was a low, powerful contralto that resonated in the stone, cutting through the silence like sharpened glass. Consort of peace. Human. The final word was an insult, a drop of poison in the royal decree. Kale swallowed, gripping his trembling hands together. This was the moment. The sacrifice. Sovereign Ilara, he replied, his voice a little too rough but steady. He could not afford weakness now. I am here as promised, to honor the treaty between Vorthos and Viridia. Her gaze finally dropped to him, and in that instant, Kale felt stripped bare, his courage measured and found wanting. The vampires around them stirred, eager for a show of submission. You stand in the heart of our power, little human, Ilara said, the corner of her perfect mouth curling in disgust. The price you pay is high. You forfeit the sun, your freedom, and your life should this peace falter. Do you accept the terms of the Warbride? I accept, Kale said clearly, meeting her gaze, forcing himself to see the queen, not the monster. For the sake of my people. Ilara's expression did not change, but a flicker, perhaps of surprise, perhaps of interest, danced in the depths of her crimson eyes. She raised a gauntlet hand. Her movement was slow, deliberate. A voice roared from the shadows to their right, a voice heavy with fury and privilege. My queen. This is an outrage. Kale's head snapped toward the source. A massive vampire, dressed in shining silver and black armor, stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. Lord Zareth, Ilara's chief general and the most vocal opponent of the human alliance. To join your bloodline with that, a mere mortal, a weakling from the ash heap of Viridia? This sullies the Vorta name. We conquered them. We should not marry them. Ilara did not even glance at Zareth. Her focus remained entirely on Kale, as if testing his reaction. Kale felt a cold surge of defiance. He was a human in a den of monsters, but he would not cower. He took a small step forward, away from Ilara's shadow. Lord Zareth, Kale said, his voice carrying surprising authority, the treaty was signed by both the Blood Council and my king. You were defeated, but not exterminated. This marriage is not a surrender of pride, but a bond of necessity. Perhaps your queen sees a future you are too blind to grasp. The hall erupted in shocked gasps. No one spoke to a lord like that, let alone a human. Zareth snarled, starting toward Kale, hand flying to the hilt of his sword. You dare speak of necessity to me, worm? I will tear your throat out. Before Zareth could take another step, Ilara moved. Not with fire or magic, but with a sudden, casual dominance that froze the entire court. She rested her gauntlet hand lightly on Kale's shoulder, a possessive gesture that felt less like protection and more like marking property. Enough, Zareth. Ilara's voice was now dangerously quiet. He is mine. The peace is mine. Your loyalty is to Vorthos, and Vorthos requires this bond to hold. You will address the consort with the respect due to my chosen. Or I will remove your tongue and feed it to the gargoyles. The threat was absolute. Zareth stopped, his face a mask of impotent fury, but he bowed deeply. As you command, my queen? Ilara's red gaze returned to Kale. Her hand still rested on his shoulder, the weight of the metal and the cold of her skin a crushing reminder of his position. The flickering light caught the dark stain of the human's blood on her glove. The wedding is concluded, Ilara announced to the court. The terms are set. The peace consort belongs to Vorthos. Let the adjustments begin. Kale looked up at the Warbride, the vampire queen who had just claimed him, and saw a dark flicker of challenge in her eyes. The war was over, but his own struggle had just begun. The aftermath of the ceremony was a blur of crimson and shadow. Kale was escorted through endless, winding corridors by two vampire guards, mute, imposing figures whose armor scraped the marble floors with every step. The citadel was vast, a cathedral dedicated to eternal night. Every banner was a dark flag of war, and every shadowed alcove seemed to hold a waiting predator. He was finally deposited into his new dwelling, the consort's suite. It was a chamber of opulent imprisonment. The walls were paneled with dark, polished wood and hung with tapestries depicting glorious vampire victories over hapless human armies, a constant visual reminder of his kingdom's defeat. The enormous bed, carved from ebony and draped in black silk, felt less like a place of rest and more like an altar. There were no windows, only thick sheets of dark, leaded glass permanently sealing the openings, ensuring that no trace of the cursed sunlight could ever touch a vampire's domain, or Kale, their newest prize. A single human man, slight and trembling, was waiting. "My Lord Kale," the man whispered, bowing so deeply his forehead nearly touched the carpet. "I am Lysander, assigned to your service. I was a servant here before the peace." Lysander's eyes were wide with fear, a fear Kale understood intimately. He was a small pocket of humanity preserved in the center of Vorthos, a subtle cruelty by Queen Ilara, a human witness to his degradation. "Stand up, Lysander," Kale said softly. "You need not fear me. But tell me, where are my belongings? My books, my family's crest?" Lysander wrung his hands. "The Queen's decree, my lord. Your personal effects are retained. You are to wear only what is provided by the citadel, to reflect your new station. You are only permitted the consort's uniform." Kale felt a slow burn of humiliation. This was not a partnership. It was a total assimilation. They had stripped him of everything that made him Kale Ryder, leaving only the empty title, Peace Consort. "Very well," Kale sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I require nothing but a moment's peace before Her Majesty arrives." Lysander gestured nervously to a small hidden washroom. "She ordered you to be ready by the 8th hour of night, my lord. She does not tolerate tardiness." Kale nodded. He understood. Everything in this court was a test of obedience, a measure of how quickly they could break the human spirit. Kale emerged 20 minutes later. He had bathed, changed into a fresh, simple silk tunic and trousers, still dark, still elegant, still utterly foreign. He sat on the edge of the large bed, the cold silk biting into his skin, and waited. He was waiting for his executioner or perhaps his wife. The two felt interchangeable. The door to his chambers did not open, the wall shifted. A section of the stone paneling smoothly slid back, revealing a dimly lit passage leading deeper into the citadel's core, straight into Ilara's private wing. Kale stood up. That single, silent act was more terrifying than a trumpet blast. It meant he was permanently connected to her. A moment later, Ilara stepped through the opening. She was no longer in her full, heavy armor. She wore a gown of dark velvet that looked like liquid shadow, high-collared and severe, but revealing just enough to remind Kale that beneath the armor was a stunning, dangerous woman. Her crown was gone, replaced by a simple, lethal-looking silver pin in her black hair. She glanced around the room, her crimson gaze dismissive, before fixing on Kale. "Do you find your new cage suitable, consort?" she asked, her voice devoid of any warmth. Kale met her eyes. "It is luxurious, your majesty. Though I find a cage is still a cage regardless of how much silk lines the bars." Ilara smiled, a predatory, humorless flash of white fangs. "A human wit. I had hoped for less insolence, but perhaps more challenge makes the arrangement entertaining. Let us be clear, Kale Ryder. This marriage is a political seal, not a union of hearts or bodies. You are a living treaty." She strode past him to a small stone table where a single carafe of deep red liquid sat. It was wine, or perhaps blood. Kale didn't want to know. "There will be no heirs," Ilara stated flatly, pouring a glass. "A union between Vorta blood and mortal filth would be an abomination. You will sleep here. I sleep beyond that door in the Queen's chambers. We will appear together for court functions, and you will speak only when addressed, and only what you have been instructed to say." She turned, holding the glass. "Your life is now a performance. Your audience is a kingdom that despises you, and a human nation that depends entirely on your compliance. Kale's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. I understood the terms, Queen Alara. My compliance is assured. My people need peace. I only ask that you also honor the treaty. The trade routes, the removal of your garrisons from the western frontier. I am the sovereign, she interrupted, taking a sip of the deep red liquid. I honor nothing but Vorthos. The treaty is merely a weapon to buy time. Time to crush the minor rebellions that plague my borders, time to rebuild my legions, and time to assess which of my generals requires a new head. She placed the glass down with a sharp click. Speaking of which, you made an impression on Lord Zareth today. I did not intend to provoke, Kale admitted. I intended to show that your consort would not be a broken toy on the first day. Had I cowered, Zareth would have dismissed me and by extension dismissed your political move. Alara tilted her head, a flicker of genuine curiosity in her eyes. Astute. You have more courage than I expected. Or less sense. Zareth sees you as the primary weakness in my rule. He believes I am soft for allowing a human to live in my citadel. He will challenge you. Not to a duel but in subtler ways. She walked slowly towards him, her movements silent, her velvet gown trailing like a predator's shadow. She stopped inches away, forcing Kale to look up into her hypnotic, crimson eyes. Her breath was cold, scented faintly with iron. If you die, Kale Rider, the treaty dissolves. Your people will pay the ultimate price, she whispered, her voice a promise and a threat combined. You must protect yourself. Not for your own sake but for theirs. And if Zareth succeeds in undermining you, I will not intervene. You are my symbol of peace, but I will not risk my crown for a fragile human. Kale did not flinch, even as the terrifying power of her presence pressed down on him. He remembered the faces of the children of Viridia, the reason he was here. Understood, Kale said, his voice now a quiet steel. Tell me what Zareth's weakness is, your majesty. For the sake of the treaty, I need to know how to keep your court stable. Alara stared at him for a long, silent moment. She had expected fear or pleading, not a request for strategic intelligence. The corner of her mouth lifted again, a darker, more genuine expression this time. His weakness, consort, she finally said, her eyes gleaming with dark amusement, is that he underestimated me. And now, perhaps, he has underestimated you. She turned, walked back through the opening to her chambers, and the stone panel slid shut with a heavy, final sound. Kale was left alone, surrounded by silence, in a room that was suddenly much colder. He was trapped, but he was not broken. The Warbride had set the rules of their forced marriage, but she had also inadvertently given him his first mission, survival against Lord Zareth. The Sovereign's weekly Blood Council meeting was a performance of calculated power. It was held in the Citadel's Grand Gallery, a long, freezing hall lined with statues of long-dead vampire kings, their stone faces sneering down upon the living. This was Kale's first formal appearance as the consort, and the atmosphere was thick with expectation, not of peace but of schadenfreude. Kale stood slightly behind Alara's throne, a position that was meant to signify proximity but felt more like he was on a leash. The throne itself was a towering monstrosity of iron and bone, making Alara, even seated, appear inhumanly tall. The assembled Blood Council, 30-odd ancient, powerful vampires who ruled the various districts and legions of Vorthos, watched Kale with cold, assessing eyes. Most of them were neutral observers, waiting to see if the Warbride's choice would prove pragmatic or idiotic. But Lord Zareth was not neutral. He stood at the head of the council, his silver armor gleaming, radiating barely contained hostility. Alara handled the council's affairs with brisk, icy efficiency, military logistics, the rationing of the crimson wine, the concentrated, iron-rich liquid that supplemented their fresh blood supply, and reports of minor border incursions. Kale, true to his instructions, remained silent, absorbing the dense, dark politics of the court. After nearly an hour, Zareth finally saw his opening. "My queen," Zareth said, his voice smooth as polished stone, yet carrying a sneer Kale felt in his gut. "We are discussing the increasing cost of securing the new western border fortifications, the very border we gained in the war against Viridia. Perhaps your new consort of peace can shed light on this issue." Alara's crimson gaze flickered over Kale. This was the moment of the test. She had warned him she would not intervene. "The consort is a human, Zareth," Alara replied, her tone neutral. "He is not familiar with our strategic logistics." "On the contrary, your majesty," Zareth countered, turning to address Kale with feigned politeness. "He is the son of the former Duke of Viridia. He spent his life training in their weak, mortal armies. He must, at the very least, understand the terrain and the human mindset we are now tasked with defending against. Tell us, Consort Rider, why is maintaining our defenses on the Viridian side so incredibly costly? The question was a trap. If Kale admitted ignorance, he was useless. If he spoke of human military weaknesses, he betrayed his people. If he tried to critique Vorthos's defenses, he'd be accused of treason. Kale took a slow, deep breath, remembering the long nights he'd spent poring over maps of the western frontier, the very maps his father had used to plan the losing war. He stepped slightly forward, catching the cold, unreadable glare of Ilara. Lord Zareth is correct, Kale began, his voice calm, projecting just enough to carry through the massive hall. I am not an expert in vampire logistics. However, I am intimately familiar with the region in question. The cost of maintaining those fortifications is high because you are defending the wrong strategic asset. A wave of shocked silence swept through the council. Zaretha's confident smirk wavered. Explain yourself, human, Ilara commanded, her voice sharp with sudden interest. Your Majesty, Kale continued, focusing only on the Queen, Viridia's western front is mountainous and resource-poor. The garrisons you hold there, like the Black Gate Fortress, are historically designed to prevent an invasion by large human armies coming into Viridia. They are not effective forward bases for the vampire's unique needs. He paused, gathering his thoughts, feeling the weight of the council's attention. The true threat to Vorthos comes not from the scattered human militias, but from the deep shadows, where the truly ancient rogue vampire lines dwell. They don't use the passes, they use the under-earth river system that flows beneath the mountains. Kale pointed to a massive dark spot on a strategic map hanging on the wall, an area Zaretha's troops were meant to be securing. That area is a cluster of ruined human watchtowers. You are spending fortunes to maintain them because they are visible. But beneath them, the underground river opens into the Whispering Chasm. That chasm is the true backdoor into Vorthos. It is where Zaretha's logistical reports repeatedly show unexplained supply losses and minor skirmishes. He looked straight at Zareth. Your current fortifications are a costly distraction. The gold should be rerouted to securing the chasm, which requires specialized Vorta magic and tunneling, not simple troop deployment. Lord Zaretha's face was a study in pure, murderous fury. He had been caught flat-footed. Kale hadn't betrayed humanity. He had exposed a flaw in Zaretha's command and logistics. A flaw only a native of the land, one who had studied its defenses for years, would know. Nonsense. Zareth boomed, recovering quickly. This is a pathetic human attempt to redirect our focus and leave the human side undefended. I accuse him of sabotage. Silence, Zareth, Ilara cut him off. She leaned forward on her throne, her chin resting on her gauntlet hand. Her crimson eyes bored into Kale. Your insight is unexpected, consort, she said, the words grudging. The Whispering Chasm is indeed a persistent nuisance. But how would you know of its strategic value to those deep shadows, as you call them? Kale did not hesitate. Because, Your Majesty, the human history books of Viridia detail the legends of the Nosferatu using those paths to raid our villages centuries ago. Our ancestors knew the chasm was the real threat. We ignored the legends at our peril. You ignore local history at the cost of your gold and soon your soldiers. Ilara was silent for a full, tense minute. The council was now whispering amongst themselves, a dark cloud of speculation. Kale had not given a simple answer. He had provided valuable intelligence. Finally, Ilara spoke, her voice low and dangerous. Lord Zareth, you will immediately dispatch a specialist team to investigate the Whispering Chasm, as the consort suggests. And you will update me directly on its findings. If the consort's information proves correct, your command over the Western Front will be severely re-evaluated. Zareth bowed, his anger barely concealed. As you command, my queen. But rest assured, I will be watching the consort's every step. He has bought himself time, but perhaps he has also bought himself a quick death. As the council dispersed, leaving only Ilara and Kale in the vast hall, the queen rose from her throne and descended the steps. You risked everything on a rumor, consort, she stated, stopping right in front of him. I risked everything on historical fact, Your Majesty, Kale corrected calmly. If you are to win a war, you must know your enemy's weaknesses. I just proved that a human can be useful. Ilara circled him slowly, her fingers brushing the dark velvet of his sleeve, a touch that sent a shiver of dread down his spine. Utility. A strong motivation for a Warbride, she murmured. But be warned, Kale Rider. You humiliated a powerful lord in front of his peers. Zareth will not attempt to kill you in the open. He will attempt to break your spirit and then present your failure to me. You are no longer just a symbol. You are now a piece on the board. She stepped past him, the soft whisper of her gown fading into the dark stone. Cale stood alone, understanding that he had survived his first political battle, but the reward was only a promotion to valuable target. Life in Vorthos was a perpetual sensory deprivation for Cale. The Citadel's permanent night had begun to wear on him. He found himself subconsciously tilting his head toward the heavy, dark glass where the sun should be, missing the warmth and the simple, natural rhythm of day and night. His days were now a tedious routine, training in a small, shadowed yard, supervised by vampire guards who looked perpetually bored, mandatory study of Vorthosian history and law, and the chilling silence of his chamber. Lysander, his human servant, was a ghost of a man, terrified to speak anything beyond basic necessities. The biggest challenge wasn't the darkness, it was the isolation. Every vampire he encountered treated him like a piece of furniture, or a potential meal. Lord Zareth, true to form, did not attempt a direct attack. His revenge was psychological. The food provided to Cale became increasingly sparse, sometimes little more than dry bread and watered-down wine. Lysander whispered that the kitchen staff loyal to Zareth were attempting to starve the human spirit. One evening, 4 days after the Blood Council meeting, Cale returned to his suite, exhausted and genuinely hungry. He found a small, covered silver tray placed on the stone table, unusual as Lysander usually brought his meals. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark rice, was a perfectly cooked piece of rare venison steak, gleaming red and juicy, accompanied by a side of fresh, wild berries. It was the first genuinely appetizing food he had seen since arriving. He picked up a silver fork, paused, and then dropped it with a clatter. It was a trap. A human meal in a vampire castle, untouched by a servant, was a blatant invitation to poison. Zareth was testing his paranoia. Cale pushed the plate aside, opting for the stale bread he had saved from his meager breakfast. He was settling down to study Vorthosian military code when the stone wall slid open. Ilara stepped through wearing a simpler high-necked black tunic and leather leggings, an outfit suitable for riding or strategy, not court. She looked tired, her movements slightly less regal but no less intimidating. She looked at the untouched venison and then at Cale, who was grimly chewing stale bread. "You refuse the rations I ordered, consort?" Ilara asked, her tone flat. "I refuse Lord Zareth's hospitality, your majesty," Cale replied, meeting her stare. "The meal is either poisoned, or engineered to make me appear ungrateful and weak. I choose to remain neither." Ilara walked over to the table. She picked up the fork Cale had dropped and, without breaking eye contact, cut a piece of the red meat. Cale watched, his breath held tight in his chest. She brought the fork to her mouth. Cale braced himself, expecting her to fake the action. Instead, she ate the piece of meat. "The venison is unadulterated," she said, chewing slowly. "It is from the royal reserves, prepared by my personal chef, who is bound to me by a blood oath, not Zareth's empty promises. It is safe." She cut another piece, held it out, and offered it to him. "Eat, Cale Rider. My warriors require strength, even my human ones. I will not have my consort collapsing from malnutrition before Zareth can discredit him." Cale hesitated only for a moment. Her act of tasting it was a gesture of trust, or at least, a demonstration of her control. He took the fork from her hand and ate the piece of venison. It was rich, flavorful, and incredibly grounding. "Thank you, your majesty," he murmured, his guard momentarily dropped. Ilara sat on the edge of the stone table, her long legs crossed. "I did not come here to act as your cook. Zareth's investigation into the Whispering Chasm confirmed your report. The tunnels are ancient, vast, and teeming with activity. The Nosferatu were using them as staging grounds. You were correct." She looked genuinely frustrated. "I lost a week's campaigning time dispatching the correct Vorta mages to seal the deepest breaches. You saved us a disastrous flank attack, consort. My generals are impressed. Zareth is furious." "I am glad to be of use," Cale said honestly, finishing the rest of the meal with desperate hunger. "Your usefulness comes at a high price," Ilara noted, her eyes narrowing. "You have forced me to acknowledge your value. Now, others will seek to steal it or destroy it. The Blood Council believes you have gained my ear. Have I?" Cale challenged softly. Ilara looked away for a moment, staring at the dark panels. "My father, the previous sovereign, surrounded himself with those who told him what he wanted to hear. He lost the war by denying the humans' resilience. I will not make that mistake. You are my window into the mortal mind, Cale. But remember, a window is a thing to be looked through, not a thing to be touched." She slid off the table and walked toward the panel. "Tomorrow you will accompany me to the southern barracks. The new vampire recruits require an object lesson in why weakness leads to defeat. You will stand beside me. You will be silent. And you will look magnificent. As the wall began to slide shut, Kale called out, Elara. She stopped, the crimson light catching her pale profile. It was the first time he had used her name, not her title. Why me? He asked. Why not a general or a minister? Why marry a human and risk this much political turmoil? Her eyes, blazing red, met his through the narrowing gap. Because consort, she said, the Warbride's voice returning, cold as the grave. When the Vorta sign a treaty with blood, they must take a sacrifice the enemy values more than gold. Your father valued you. And now Vorthos values your sacrifice. You are the bond. And I am tired of war. The wall slid completely closed, plunging Kale back into the profound, oppressive silence. He was no longer just the peace consort. He was the symbol of Vorthos's commitment to temporary peace, a beautiful, living, and very necessary hostage. And for a fleeting moment he thought he saw something in Elara's eyes beyond cruelty, a weary loneliness that matched his own. The journey to the southern barracks was Kale's first time outside the confines of the citadel. The night was cold, the sky above Vorthos a deep, starless indigo. They traveled in a heavily armored carriage drawn by massive, shadowy beasts, not horses but something larger, with eyes that glowed faintly green. Kale sat opposite Elara, the small space magnifying the chasm between them. She was in a high-collared, military-style jacket, her gaze fixed on the passing cobblestone streets of the city. He could see that Vorthos was a city built for war and eternity. The buildings were jagged, their spires piercing the gloom like spears, and the streets were almost empty, save for the occasional swift, cloaked figure. My city is not built for comfort, consort, Elara said, sensing his observation. It is built for survival. You will learn its geometry quickly, or you will be lost. I am already lost, Your Majesty, Kale replied quietly. But I have learned to follow the straight line back to survival. Elara offered no response, only a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The barracks were vast, carved into the side of a large cliff face. Thousands of vampire recruits, young, eager, and utterly ruthless, were gathered in the central courtyard, bathed in the sickly green light of arcane torches. When Elara and Kale stepped out, the silence that fell was instant and absolute. The sight of their Warbride queen and her human consort standing side by side was clearly a shock. Elara walked to a raised platform, Kale a step behind her. Her presence was a physical force. Even the newest recruits straightened their spines, terrified and devoted in equal measure. Look upon the consort, Elara commanded, her voice ringing across the courtyard. Look upon Kale, rider of Viridia. He is the symbol of the costly peace we have achieved. A peace that demands sacrifice. Her speech was a masterclass in propaganda, acknowledging Kale's presence while defining it as a trophy of war. She spoke of Vorthos' strength and the weakness of mortals. Then she moved to the object lesson. Bring forward the deserter, she ordered. 2 armored guards dragged a screaming, struggling figure into the center of the courtyard. He was a low-ranking human soldier from the former Viridian border garrison, the very place Kale had saved Elara's forces from attacking the wrong flank. This creature was found weeks ago, hiding in the mountains, attempting to flee his duty to his own king, Elara announced. He has no loyalty to his own kind and certainly none to Vorthos. This is the definition of weakness. Kale felt a cold wave of nausea. He recognized the man, a nervous, young recruit named Sergeant Elias, who had deserted during the war's final, brutal days. Kale's father had known Elias's family. He knew what was coming. Elara glanced at Kale. It was a calculated, deliberate moment. She was daring him to object, daring him to show the weakness of human empathy in front of her legions. You will be silent, she had commanded. You are my symbol of peace. The air shimmered as Lord Zareth suddenly appeared at the edge of the platform. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He smiled, a slow, venomous grin aimed directly at Kale. My queen, Zareth purred, stepping forward. May I suggest a more fitting punishment for the betrayer? Let the peace consort strike the final blow. It would be a powerful symbol, the human consort rejecting the weakness of his own kind, embracing Vorthos' law. It would silence any future whispers of his loyalty. The entire courtyard held its breath. Zareth had expertly turned Elara's object lesson into a direct, horrifying challenge for Kale. If Kale refused, he proved his weakness and disloyalty, validating Zareth's claims. If he complied, he would execute a man from his own land, destroying his own soul. Elara's crimson eyes narrowed, focusing on Zareth's insolence. But before she could speak, Kale stepped forward. The crowd of vampires tensed, waiting for the expected plea or refusal. Your Majesty, Kale's voice was steady, projecting his fear and his resolve in equal measure. Lord Zareth's suggestion is excellent. But I must refuse the honor. A low murmur rippled through the recruits. Zareth looked triumphant. Why, consort? Ilara's voice was sharp. Do you lack the stomach for duty? Kale turned to face the ranks, standing tall despite the terror in his heart. I lack the authority, your majesty. This man, Elias, was a soldier of Viridia. He failed his duty to my king. The laws of Vorthos cannot punish a human for failing a human oath. He turned back to Ilara. If Vorthos wishes to execute him as an object lesson against weakness, that is your law. But for the sake of the peace treaty, which demands the respect of both nations' sovereignty, a Vorthosian must be the one to administer Vorthosian justice. If I do it, it implies that Viridia has ceded its sovereignty entirely, making the peace treaty meaningless. It would suggest Viridia is already broken, and requires no further diplomacy, only subjugation. He had found the flaw. Kale had not pleaded for the man's life. He had argued for the integrity of the treaty itself, the very thing Ilara valued. A muscle twitched in Ilara's jaw. She looked at Kale, her expression shifting from calculation to something akin to grim satisfaction. She turned to Zareth, her voice a whip of cold air. The consort is correct. A human cannot execute a human under Vorthosian law without diminishing the status of the treaty. Lord Zareth, you introduced the deserter. You suggested the execution. The task of showing Vorthosian justice therefore falls to you. Demonstrate the power of this kingdom. Zareth's triumphant expression vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and barely contained fury. Ilara had just turned his challenge back on him, forcing him to do the dirty work publicly, while Kale maintained his honor and strategic value. The moment Zareth realized he was cornered, he drew his immense broadsword. The human deserter, Elias, seeing Kale had fought for him in the only way he could, stopped struggling, his eyes meeting Kale's in a silent look of gratitude and resignation. Zareth did the deed quickly, savagely, demonstrating pure, brutal power. The entire courtyard was silenced by the stark reality of vampire law. Ilara stepped to the edge of the platform and addressed the bloodied Zareth. This, recruits, is the price of failure. And this, she gestured to a pale, horrified but standing Kale, is the enduring symbol of the price we paid for peace. As they were escorted back to the carriage, Kale was shaking. He had saved his life, but he hadn't saved Elias. Ilara spoke her back to him. You were clever, consort. You used my own treaty terms against Zareth. But you saw the face of the man who died. Do you regret not pleading for him? I regret the war that made him a deserter, Kale said, his voice raw. But if I had pleaded, you would have executed us both. I would have failed my people and myself. I choose survival, your majesty. For the sake of the fragile peace. Ilara finally turned to him, her eyes burning like embers in the dark carriage. Good. Never forget that choice, Kale Rider. Because to survive in Vorthos, you must always choose the many over the one. Even when that one is your own soul. The air of cautious respect that Kale had earned from Ilara's lieutenants was offset by a fresh wave of resentment from Lord Zareth's faction. The public humiliation at the barracks had wounded the general's pride deeply. Kale knew the response wouldn't be political this time. It would be a direct attempt to compromise his health, his sanity, or his moral standing. He was right. The next evening, Kale found a beautifully carved, ornate wooden box waiting in his chambers. It wasn't left by Lysander, it was placed directly on his bed, a blatant challenge. Kale examined it for poison dust, hidden runes, and tripwires before slowly opening the lid. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a Vorthosian ceremonial dagger, a piece of exquisite craftsmanship with a blade forged from dark obsidian and a hilt wrapped in fine silver wire. It was clearly a gift of status, a tool a high-ranking consort might use for minor ceremonial bloodletting. Attached to the box was a single rolled piece of parchment, tied with a black ribbon. Kale unrolled the note. The writing was a sharp, aggressive script, clearly Zareth's. Consort Rider. My queen requires utility, not sentimental weakness. The greatest gift a human can give Vorthos is a display of its own kind's loyalty to our rule. Use this blade to secure your position. The old gardener, Torvin, has served the citadel for 50 years, tending the queen's private moon gardens. He is a relic. Cut his throat and leave him by the fountain tonight. It will be proof that you value Vorthos over your dying world. Deny me this proof, and you prove yourself a traitor to the treaty. Zareth was demanding a blood sacrifice, a helpless, ancient human servant, killed in cold blood, to demonstrate Kale's loyalty. It was designed to force Kale to break his principles or face execution for treason. Kale clenched the dagger's hilt, the cold obsidian biting into his palm. He was trapped. He could not kill an innocent man. But if he failed to act, Zareth would present the failure to Alara as proof of his treachery. He had to consult his one terrifying strategic ally. Kale walked to the sliding stone panel and paused. He had never initiated contact. But this was an immediate life-or-death decision. He knocked sharply on the hidden stone. After a tense, drawn-out minute, the panel slid open. Alara stood there, unbound, wearing only a flowing silk robe of deep crimson. Her long, black hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders. She looked less like the Warbride and more like a mythological creature, ethereal, yet utterly lethal. "You intrude, consort," she said, her voice low, laced with annoyance. "This better be a matter of life and death, as that is precisely what I will administer if you waste my time." Kale stepped into her private chamber, a space far more Spartan and strategic than his own, dominated by large maps and a desk covered in war plans. He ignored her intimidating appearance and thrust the dagger and the note toward her. "Zareth is testing me," Kale said, his breathing ragged. "He demands I kill the gardener, Torvin, to prove my loyalty to Vorthos. If I refuse, he presents this note to the council and I am a traitor. If I comply, I break my soul and lose all moral ground with my people, making me useless to you as a political bridge." Alara took the dagger, her pale fingers wrapping around the hilt. She read Zareth's note, her expression unreadable. "Zareth is predictable," she finally said, dropping the note onto a map. "He believes all humans are weak, sentimental fools. He thinks to break you by forcing you to choose between your conscience and your life." She looked at Kale, her crimson eyes searching his. "What is your plan, consort? Do you have one, or do you intend to stand there and wait for the grave to open?" Kale took a deep breath, his mind racing. "I will not kill Torvin. But I cannot allow Zareth to use this note. I need to give Zareth proof of my action, without committing the murder. And how does a human lie to a vampire general who can smell fresh blood?" Alara challenged, a hint of dark amusement in her voice. "I need your help, your majesty," Kale stated, meeting her gaze with desperate sincerity. "I need fresh blood, a lot of it, placed near the fountain to look like the crime scene. And I need Torvin to disappear immediately, hidden deep within the citadel's lowest levels, perhaps in the old dungeons where no one ventures. I need to stage an execution and create an untraceable victim." Alara stared at him, the silence stretching taut between them. Kale could practically hear the political gears turning in her ancient mind. "You ask me to risk my reputation and potentially treason charges, to protect a dying human gardener and your mortal conscience?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I ask you to protect the peace treaty, your majesty," Kale countered firmly. "I ask you to show Zareth that his petty, predictable plots will fail. If you help me defeat this, my political value to you skyrockets. If I fall to this trap, your consort is discredited, and Zareth gains the authority to challenge your rule." A slow, chilling smile spread across Alara's face. It wasn't warm, it was the satisfied look of a brilliant strategist. "Your intellect is a fine weapon, consort," she murmured. "Very well. I will protect my investment. I have old reservoirs of animal blood used for sacrificial rites. And I have guards whose loyalty is sworn to my bloodline alone. The gardener will vanish. The dagger will be returned, cleaned but used, and the crime will be discovered tomorrow morning." She stepped closer to Kale, placing the cold dagger back into his hand. Their fingers brushed, and Kale felt a shocking jolt, the first physical contact not mandated by ritual or threat. "Go, consort. Stage your gruesome scene," Alara commanded, her voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous whisper. "But know that you are now officially complicit in an act of high deception against my most powerful general. We are aligned in this darkness, Kale Ryder. Do not fail me." Kale looked down at the dagger, then up at the magnificent, ruthless woman who had just agreed to cover up a staged murder for him. The line between prisoner and partner had blurred dangerously. The crimson sun, as the Vorthosians ironically called the glow of the distant human sunrise that barely touched their city's highest spires, had not yet appeared when the citadel erupted in whispered chaos. Kale stood in his suite, dressed in fresh black silk, drinking a cup of bitter, earthy brew that passed for coffee in Vorthos. He felt the cold hollowness of the previous night's deception. He hadn't killed Torvin, but he had allowed a man's presumed death to be used as a political shield. His hands were clean, but his conscience was stained by complicity. Alara's execution of the plan was flawless. The guards loyal to her had sealed off the moon garden, spilled the sacrificial animal blood dramatically near the fountain, and most importantly secured the old gardener, Torvin, deep within the hidden sanctuary beneath the citadel's east wing. Torvin was safe, but officially he was dead by Kale's hand. The heavy, metallic clang of an armored fist on his sliding door announced the morning's first confrontation. The wall opened not to Alara, but to a seething Lord Zareth, flanked by two enormous, silent guards. Zareth's face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes were not just red, they seemed to be pulsing with internal flame. "Consort Rider," Zareth hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "A noble deed. You have proven, finally, that you possess the necessary cruelty for Vorthos. The old fool's blood was found by the Moongarden fountain, along with your dagger." He held up the gleaming obsidian dagger that Kale had used. It was clean, polished, but the cold light reflected on its surface seemed to bear witness to the lie. Kale met Zareth's gaze with forced calmness. "I have no idea what you are referring to, Lord Zareth. I received a gift. I returned the gift and used. Perhaps you should ask the Queen how the blade came to be near the Moongarden. It is her property after all." Zareth's lip curled in disbelief. "Do not insult my intelligence, human. The note, the blood, the location, it was a test of loyalty. And you passed it by executing a servant of humanity. You are a traitor to your own kind, Kale Rider, and a serviceable beast to Vorthos. You are no longer harmless." "I am the peace consort," Kale corrected him, standing his ground. "I serve the treaty which the Queen values. If that treaty demands the removal of any perceived weakness, I will not hesitate. You forced my hand. I acted. And now, you have proof that I am willing to pay the price of admission to this court." Zareth leaned in close, his cold breath washing over Kale. "You won a minor battle, consort. You traded a human's life for political standing. But you are treading on ancient ground. Be careful where you spill your lies. If I find even a thread of deception in this matter, I will not only tear your throat out, but I will deliver your people to the blade myself." He straightened, his gaze burning with promise. "Enjoy your newfound status, consort. It will be short-lived." Zareth turned abruptly and left, the stone wall sliding shut behind him. Kale let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his facade of control crumbling slightly. The encounter, while strategically won, had shaken him. Later that night, the stone panel opened quietly, and Alara entered, carrying a heavy leather-bound scroll. She seemed relaxed, a slight, almost invisible tremor of amusement around her crimson eyes. "Zareth is convinced you are a cold-blooded turncoat, worthy of his hatred but useful to my throne," she reported, laying the scroll on the table. He presented his findings to the council, expecting them to be outraged by the murder. Instead, they were impressed by your ruthlessness. You have silenced his accusations of your sentimentality. "I am glad to be of service, Your Majesty," Kale said dryly. "But my utility came at the cost of staging a murder. We now share a secret, a profound deception." Alara walked to him, stopping closer than she ever had before in private. The intimacy of their shared crime created an undeniable, dangerous tension. "You speak of secrets, consort? Sharing a secret with a Warbride means you are now irrevocably bound to my survival," she murmured. "Zareth will not stop. He will escalate. He will look for a way to prove that the murder was a lie." She reached out a pale, elegant hand and gently brushed his collar. Kale froze, unsure if it was a threat or a gesture of strange, political intimacy. "I need you to survive, Kale Rider," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense tone. "To that end, I have a new assignment for you. You have proven your knowledge of the human borders and their histories. You will accompany me on my upcoming inspection tour of the Western Frontier." Kale looked at her, stunned. "The Western Frontier? That's days from the Citadel. It's dangerous. We'll be exposed." "Precisely," Alara confirmed, her eyes glittering with dark calculation. "Zareth cannot touch you under my direct military protection. But more importantly, the Nosferatu threat in the Whispering Chasm is escalating. I need your eyes on the ground. I need your perspective on how an ancient, subterranean enemy would move against my forces." She leaned closer, her breath cool against his ear. "This is not a vacation, consort. This is a field test. Your greatest adjustment will not be to this society but to war. If you die out there, Zareth wins. But if you help me defeat this hidden enemy, you become indispensable." She stepped back, her expression now fully regal. "The details of the trip are in this scroll. We leave at the 8th hour of the next night. Prepare yourself, Kale. The real darkness awaits." Kale looked from the scroll to Alara. He was no longer a political hostage. He was a strategic military advisor, bound by a murderous secret to the most powerful vampire in Vorthos. The price of peace was not just his freedom, but his active participation in the war that was now brewing. The travel coach that left the Citadel at the 8th hour was nothing like the ornate monstrosity Kale had arrived in. This was a stripped-down, armored carriage designed for speed and silence, drawn by 4 fierce-looking night hunters. Kale was dressed in new practical travel attire, dark leather and padded cloth, much like the light armor of a human scout. Inside the space was tight. Kale sat across from Ilara, who wore the heavy, obsidian armor he had first seen her in, her helmet resting beside her. Only the thin, crimson line of her mouth and the perpetual intensity of her eyes were visible. The forced proximity of the journey was palpable. 2 elite, high-ranking vampire guards rode outside, ensuring no one, especially Lord Zaratha's spies, could approach. The silence was heavier than the citadel's gloom. It was Kale who finally broke it. "Your Majesty, the path we are taking is not the main military road. It's the old smuggler's route, notoriously rough and slow." Ilara's gaze sharpened. "You know this path? It cuts through the foothills of the Dragon's Tooth Range," Kale explained, gesturing faintly on the dark interior wall. "My father's scouts used it to monitor border activity years ago. It's slower, yes, but it avoids the major intersections controlled by Zaratha's troops. You are avoiding a potential accident." A ghost of a smile, a flash of dark amusement, crossed Ilara's lips. "Good observation, consort. You have confirmed my choice. When going into the field, one must trust one's intelligence over one's generals. I trust that Zarath is watching the main road for a chance to intercept or perhaps ambush us." Kale felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He still believes the murder of Torvin was genuine. Why risk your life when you could simply order Zaratha's execution? "Because," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a low, intense rumble, "if I execute Zarath without absolute, undeniable proof of treason, his entire faction revolts. It would destabilize Vorthos and break the treaty immediately. I need proof that he is colluding with the enemy, or, failing that, I need to demonstrate my power is beyond his reach." She picked up her helmet, her crimson eyes holding his. "Our journey is not just about the Nosferatu, Kale. It is about presenting a united front. It is about showing my court that the Warbride's human consort is not a burden, but a valuable shield." They traveled for hours through a desolate, rocky landscape that was once the no-man's land between the 2 kingdoms. Kale, deprived of sleep, eventually slumped against the rough leather of the seat. He startled awake some time later, jolted by the carriage hitting a pothole. He looked up to find Ilara staring at him. She hadn't moved. The relentless nature of a vampire's eternal wakefulness was terrifying. "You sleep like a soldier," she observed. "I sleep like a human," Kale corrected, rubbing his eyes. "We require rest to survive. It's a fundamental weakness, I know." "It is a difference," Ilara countered, surprisingly. "My general, Lord Valerius, was a master strategist, but he failed to consider the human need for provisions and sleep. It cost him half his legion. You understand these limitations. That is your strength." She slid a small silver flask across the floor of the carriage. "Drink. It is fortified with iron and spices. It will help you endure the coming days." Kale picked up the flask. The metal was cold. He uncorked it, expecting the taste of blood or strong wine. Instead, it was a thick, sweet liquid, a concentrated form of the human energy drink his people used on long marches. It was clearly prepared for him. "You are worried about my endurance, Your Majesty?" Kale noted, taking a long, grateful sip. "I am worried about my investment, consort," Ilara corrected, though her tone was milder than usual. "The western frontier is volatile. The further we get from the citadel, the more the rules of court politics fall away, and the rules of survival take over. You were right about the Whispering Chasm. The tunnels have become major lines of attack for the Nosferatu. They are larger, far older, and far more numerous than the council believed." She leaned in, her voice low with genuine urgency. "They are not like Zaratha's legions. They are savage, feral, and driven by an ancient hunger that is not political. I need you to tell me how Viridia would have defended against an unseen enemy that attacks from below." Kale felt a rush of adrenaline. This was not a test of political wit. This was a plea for genuine military counsel. "The Nosferatu are cave dwellers," Kale said, thinking aloud. "They hate fire, sunlight, and any disruption of their dark passages. Viridia would use tunnel warfare. We'd collapse their exit points, use large-scale incendiaries, and focus on sealing the chasm, not fighting them in the open." Ilara's eyes were locked on his. "Sealing the chasm. Zarath argues for a direct, ground-level assault. A show of force." "A show of force is exactly what the Nosferatu want," Kale scoffed. "They want your soldiers on the surface, distracted, while their armies flank you from the shadows beneath. The goal is to survive, not to look glorious. You have to kill the threat at its source." The carriage jolted violently and came to a grinding halt. A moment later, the door was pulled open by one of the armored guards. My queen. The road is blocked. A massive fissure. We suspect Nosferatu sabotage. Ilara grabbed her helmet and rose, her movements swift and fluid. We walked the rest of the way to the forward base. Kale Rider, you stay close to me. Your knowledge of the local terrain is now your life and my shield. Do not fail me, consort. Kale scrambled out of the carriage. The air was frigid, the ground uneven. Ahead, a massive, jagged tear split the road, the silent, aggressive signature of the hidden enemy. Ilara led the way, a figure of dark, implacable power. Kale followed, a human suddenly thrust into a life-or-death march through the vampire wilderness, bound to his Warbride by a fragile, strategic thread. The march toward the forward base was a brutal education for Kale. Ilara, unburdened by the need for rest or sustained respiration, moved with relentless, terrifying efficiency. Her two elite guards, Varan and Lyra, matched her stride, their heavy armor making barely a sound on the shattered rock. Kale, relying on the energy drink in sheer terror, struggled to keep pace. The ground grew rougher, the air colder. The jagged fissure that had blocked the road was now a constant feature, snaking across the landscape like a freshly healed wound. This was the surface evidence of the vast whispering chasm network Kale had warned about. We are close to the chasm's main convergence point, Kale gasped, his lungs burning. The air is thinner here and the stone feels hollow beneath my boots. They are active. Ilara stopped abruptly, raising a gauntlet hand. The guards instantly formed a defensive perimeter. We stop here, Ilara commanded, her voice low. Varan, secure the high ground. Lyra, assess the fissure. Kale leaned against a rough boulder, trying to stabilize his breathing. The forced proximity was intense. In the harsh, desolate wilderness, Ilara was less the distant queen and more a terrifyingly competent general, and he was her only immediate, non-vampire resource. Your Majesty, Kale whispered, the Nosferatu rarely attack on open ground. They prefer to strike when their prey is distracted by the terrain or an ambush. This area feels too quiet. As if summoned by his caution, a low, rasping sound echoed from the dark fissures around them, a sound like stone grinding on bone. Lyra, who was kneeling by the crack in the ground, suddenly cried out. Queen. They are rising. Fissures are opening beneath us. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble violently. Small, jagged openings, previously hidden, tore open across the rocky surface. From the sudden black mouths of the earth emerged creatures that made the average Vorthosian vampire look like nobility. These were the Nosferatu. They were shorter, hunched, their skin a mottled, dark gray, and their features bat-like and grotesque. They moved with unsettling speed, their limbs ending in long razor-sharp claws. They were feral, ancient, and numerous. Defensive formation. Ilara roared, drawing the massive black broadsword that had been strapped to her back. Varan and Lyra immediately engaged, their heavy armor deflecting the initial flurry of claws. Kale, frozen in place, was suddenly face to face with a creature that snarled, its black eyes burning with savage hunger. Kale instinctively raised his arms, but before the claws could connect, a blur of obsidian armor slammed between them. Ilara had moved. She did not use finesse, she used crushing power. Her sword carved through the Nosferatu like paper, the sheer force of the blow sending the creature spiraling back into the fissure it emerged from. She spun, her sword now aimed at Kale's chest. Consort, are you useless? No. Kale yelled, scrambling for his bearings. He was unarmed save for the small decorative dagger he'd been given for show, utterly useless against their armor. They are coming from the ground. We need to stop the emergence. Kale shouted over the din of clashing metal and screeching creatures. Target the openings. The chasm is their weakness. Ilara nodded sharply, acknowledging his tactical sense even in the chaos. Lyra, Varan, seal the breaches. But there were too many Nosferatu. They were swarming Ilara's two guards, focused on creating a path to their high-value target, the Vorthosian queen. One creature, faster and smarter than the rest, bypassed the fight, leaping directly towards Ilara's exposed flank. Ilara, focused on commanding her position, didn't see it. Queen. Left side. Kale screamed, his voice hoarse. With no time to think, Kale did the only thing a human could do. He threw the nearest heavy object, the water flask he had been carrying, with all his might. It struck the Nosferatu square on the temple, a pathetic but sudden distraction. The Nosferatu paused, turning its feral attention to the new weak target. This momentary delay was all Ilara needed. She twisted, her armor grinding, and brought her sword in a brutal horizontal sweep. The blade met the creature's midsection with a sickening crunch. The Nosferatu was cleaved in two, the pieces falling back into the fissure. Ilara's breath was shallow, her crimson eyes blazing. She turned to Kale, not with gratitude but with ferocious intensity. "You saved my life, consort," she stated, her voice tight with disbelief and annoyance. "I saved my people's peace treaty," Kale corrected, his hands shaking. "The longer you fight on the surface, the more of their allies arrive. We need to get underground. The forward base is near. We can draw them towards the main chasm tunnel and use the arcane explosives there." Ilara looked at the swirling chaos, then back at Kale's frantic, desperate honesty. She made a split-second decision. "Forward march," she commanded, pushing Kale ahead of her. "Varan, Lyra, clear a path to the ridge. Consort Ryder is now our lead scout. He knows the terrain better than we do. Follow his directions." Kale, suddenly thrust into the role of field commander, plunged into the rocky gloom, the Warbride Queen of Vorthos and her two powerful guards falling into formation behind him. He was a human leading vampires through the darkness, relying only on his knowledge of the world they had conquered. The real journey had begun. The forward base, Outpost Obsidian, was a grim, temporary fortress dug into the high ridge overlooking the chasm network. It was less a castle and more a strategic hole in the earth, guarded by a handful of cold, weary vampire soldiers. Ilara and her party arrived exhausted, Kale physically, the vampires perhaps only mentally. Kale was immediately directed to the command tent, a cavern carved directly into the rock. "Report, consort," Ilara commanded, shedding her heavy helmet with a sigh that was almost human. Her black hair, wet with condensation, stuck to her pale forehead. The stress of the immediate battle had stripped away her formal distance, leaving a raw edge of command. Kale, despite his fatigue, felt the adrenaline rush of his new role. He spread the tattered maps of the region on the rough-hewn table. "The attacks were concentrated at the surface entry points," Kale explained, tracing a finger along the fissures. "But the quantity of Nosferatu suggests this isn't a raiding party. It's a full-scale advance force. They weren't trying to raid the supplies, they were trying to delay you from reaching this outpost." "Why delay me?" Ilara questioned, leaning over the map, her pale skin dangerously close to his. The proximity was intoxicating and terrifying. "Because they are preparing their main attack elsewhere," Kale said, pointing to a large, unmarked area on the map, a subterranean lake known in human legend as the Black Pool. "The Nosferatu need water and darkness to sustain their numbers during a long advance. If they're planning a full assault on the Citadel, they'll be massing at the Black Pool, the largest natural cavern in the region. And they are using the surface skirmishes as a screen." Ilara straightened, her eyes wide with cold alarm. "The Black Pool. That cavern is huge. If they are there, 1,000 could be massed beneath our feet. My father deemed that area cursed and sealed off all Vorthosian tunnels near it centuries ago." "The Nosferatu don't respect curses, your majesty," Kale countered grimly. "They respect power. If they have found a way to use the Black Pool as a staging ground, we are looking at an existential threat, not a border skirmish." Ilara dismissed her guards with a curt gesture, leaving only her and Kale alone in the cold, lamplit tent. She turned, her gaze locking onto his, the intensity startling. "You understand this war better than my seasoned generals, Kale Ryder," Ilara stated, her voice quiet. "Tell me why. Did your people know of the Nosferatu's true strength?" Kale hesitated, then felt the strange, desperate loyalty born of shared danger. Viridia's priests kept ancient records. The Nosferatu are not merely feral vampires. They are the failure of your civilization. When the Vorta bloodline rejected their darker, primal instincts, the Nosferatu were driven underground. They hate Vorthos not for its power but for its order. Their existence is a living testament to the blood sacrifices your ancestors committed. "A living testament," Ilara murmured, her face etched with exhaustion and thought. "My whole life has been dedicated to defending the order of Vorthos. I fought your people to ensure that order. And now, I depend on a human's whispers to defend it from its own ancient shadow." She sat heavily on a nearby supply crate, the regal posture momentarily abandoned. "The truth is, consort, Zareth is right about one thing: I am not yet secure on my throne. My campaign against Viridia was necessary to unify a fractured Vorthos. If I admit the Nosferatu threat is real and overwhelming, the Council will turn on me, claiming I have failed to protect the kingdom. Zareth will seize power and break the peace to launch a glorious, suicidal charge." Kale saw not the ruthless Warbride, but a queen cornered by ancient politics and a hidden enemy. He sat across from her, the map between them like a fragile bridge. "You need a surgical strike, your majesty," Kale whispered. "You need proof of the Black Pool gathering, and you need to cripple their forces before the Council forces your hand." I can get that proof. Ilara looked up, her crimson eyes suddenly sharp with interest. How? The path to the Black Pool is too dangerous for even my elite guards. But not for a human, Kale said, the realization sinking in. I am mortal. I am weak. The Nosferatu will look for powerful Vortis scouts, not a fragile human wandering lost. I can navigate the old tunnels the human slaves used to dig centuries ago. I know their weak spots. I can find the Black Pool, map the numbers and return. Alone. Ilara rose, her shadow falling over him. She reached out, her pale hand resting on his shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership but also of profound, terrible trust. If you go into that darkness, consort, you will either become a legend or fertilizer for the stone, Ilara said, her voice husky. If you succeed, your position will be untouchable. Zareth will be powerless. And the treaty, the peace will be secured on a foundation of genuine partnership. She leaned in, her cold breath on his cheek. But if you betray me, if you are working for Zareth or for your old kingdom, I will not only kill you, Kale Rider. I will ensure your entire bloodline is extinguished from this earth. Do we have an agreement, consort? Kale didn't flinch. He looked into her eyes, seeing his own desperate hope for peace reflected in her fierce need for stability. We have an agreement, Your Majesty, Kale affirmed. I will bring you the proof. We leave tonight. Kale's preparations were simple, reflecting his mortality. He packed a few concentrated rations, the fortified drink from Ilara, a worn leather journal for mapping, and a single lantern that he would keep dim to a faint ember. He knew the Nosferatu were drawn to light, but the old human tunnels were pitch black. Before the 8th hour of the night, Kale stood before Ilara in the command tent. She had changed into a lighter black leather tunic and trousers, her armor left behind, a sign that she was not expecting a fight but rather an agonizing wait. The route is marked on this scroll, Ilara said, her voice strained, pointing to a rough map. It leads through the old slave ducts, small, forgotten passages. They should be clear of Vorthosian patrols and hopefully free of Nosferatu activity. Their attention will be on the main chasm. I know these ducts, Kale confirmed, tracing the lines. My ancestors' work. They know how to hide secrets from their masters. Ilara lifted her gaze, a profound, unreadable mixture of fear and calculated necessity in her crimson eyes. If you do not return by the end of the 3rd night, I will assume you are dead, and I will be forced to launch Zaretha's frontal assault to preserve my authority. Do you understand the time limit, consort? I understand, Kale affirmed. 3 nights. 72 hours. The maximum a human could endure under sustained physical and mental stress in the perpetual night of Vorthos. She took a step closer. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Kale, she said, using his first name again, the sound raw on her tongue. If you are captured, do not break. You carry the secret of the Black Pool. If the Nosferatu learn we know their location, the entire kingdom falls. I will not break, Kale promised, his voice steady. He had sacrificed his home, his honor, and now his safety. He would not sacrifice the treaty. Ilara's pale hand reached up, and for the first time she touched his face, not with the casual dominance of ownership, but with a strange, fleeting tenderness, her cold fingertips resting against his cheek. Return to me, consort, she commanded, the words sounding more like a desperate plea wrapped in royal decree. I require your mind to win this war. And I will require a full report. Kale didn't dare move. He simply nodded, absorbing the sheer vulnerability beneath the Warbride's armor. For the peace, he whispered, and then he turned and slipped out into the darkness. The entrance to the slave ducts was a narrow, hidden fissure behind the outpost supply caves, cleverly disguised by loose rock and rubble. Kale squeezed through, pulling the rocks back into place to seal his entry. He was immediately plunged into suffocating darkness, the air stale and heavy with the scent of wet stone and millennia of forgotten life. He lit the dim lantern. The walls of the duct were rough, hastily hewn stone, too small for a fully armored vampire to walk upright. This was his advantage. Hours melted away in the silent, grinding work of the solo march. Kale relied on memory, maps, and the faint, almost psychic sense of direction his forebears, the tunnel slaves, had passed down. He navigated collapsed sections, crawled through choking narrow passages, and constantly checked for the telltale rasp of Nosferatu claws. On the floor of one long passage, Kale found a horrifying sight, the dry, bleached skeleton of a Vorthosian guard, his obsidian armor mangled, his head cleanly severed. The Nosferatu had been here. They weren't just using the large chasms, they were scouting the ancient ducts too. Kale pressed himself against the cold wall, extinguishing his lantern. He spent a terrifying hour in absolute darkness, relying on the faint thump-thump of his own frantic heartbeat. When he finally relit the lantern, he was deeper in the ducts and the air had changed. It was colder and a faint, sweet, metallic scent drifted in, the smell of stagnant water and iron. He was close to the black pool. Cale dropped to his hands and knees, crawling through a final narrow section that opened into a massive echoing cavern. He raised his lantern slightly. The sight that met his eyes was staggering. The black pool was an enormous subterranean lake that absorbed all light, its surface like polished obsidian. Around its edges, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Nosferatu were gathered, huddled masses of dark, grotesque forms, waiting silently. They were not fighting, they were preparing. And Cale saw their leader. Standing on a raised pedestal of rock in the center of the gathering was a figure far larger than the average Nosferatu, draped in shredded black robes and holding a staff tipped with a skull. This was no feral beast. This was a general. A true ancient. The air around him shimmered with dark, controlled power. Cale quickly pulled out his journal and charcoal pencil, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to draw the numbers, the formation, and the leader. This was the proof Alara needed. As Cale sketched frantically, a noise from the back of the cavern made his blood run cold. A low, guttural growl. A patrol. They weren't looking up. They were searching the edges of the cavern, right where Cale was hiding. He dropped flat, pulling the hood of his dark tunic over his head, extinguishing the lantern. He was now relying on the total darkness to protect him, just meters away from the largest gathering of Vorthos's most ancient enemies. He had the proof. Now he just needed to survive the return journey. Back at Outpost Obsidian, Alara stood in the command tent, staring fixedly at the black, sealed entrance of the slave ducts. Her two guards, Varan and Lyra, maintained a respectful distance. She hadn't rested. She hadn't left the tent. She was queen, warrior, and strategist, but the weight of the gamble was crushing. She had sent her only reliable strategic asset, the human Cale Rider, into the most dangerous place in the realm. If he is captured, I will kill his entire bloodline. The thought she had used to ensure his loyalty now tasted like bitter ash. She didn't want him to break, but she didn't want him to die either. She needed the proof. But more than that, she found herself needing the presence of the fragile, defiant human whose cold logic had managed to pierce the darkness of her eternal solitude. The long night stretched on, making a mockery of her ancient patience. The air in the Black Pool cavern was thick with the scent of damp earth and the quiet, terrifying presence of the gathered Nosferatu. Cale lay motionless, flattened behind a pillar of rock, his heart beating a frantic tattoo against the cold stone. The faint, guttural growls of the approaching patrol grew louder, their heavy, dragging footsteps sending tremors through the rock. He had the map, the sketches, and the overwhelming knowledge of the enemy's strength. But his window for escape was closing rapidly. The patrol passed inches from his hiding spot, their dark forms blending with the shadows. Their breathing was a harsh, rasping sound. Cale waited until the sound of their retreat was swallowed by the cavern's vast echo, then risked a glance. The immense figure of the Nosferatu general still stood on the dais, silent and commanding. Cale knew a frontal escape was impossible. He realized his only chance was the water. Cale slipped silently towards the black pool. The water was frigid, still, and impossibly dark. It was said to have narcotic properties, capable of lulling mortals into an eternal sleep. But it was also the only way the ancient slave ducts, his escape route, could have been preserved from collapse. Holding his journal and charcoal pencil securely wrapped in oilskin within his tunic, Cale plunged into the icy water. The shock was immediate, stealing his breath. The cold bit into his skin, making his muscles seize. He swam silently along the edge of the cavern, keeping his body pressed against the wet rock, trusting the dense shadows and the Nosferatu's contempt for water to hide him. After what felt like an eternity, Cale located the submerged entrance to the old drainage tunnels, a cramped, water-filled hole barely big enough for his body. He took a final deep gulp of stale air, pushed off the bank and swam into the utter, blinding blackness of the tunnel. The journey back was a torment of claustrophobia and physical exhaustion. He was crawling through darkness, navigating by touch and memory, the cold water chilling him to the bone. Every scrape of his body against the rough stone, every ragged gasp for breath in the cramped air pockets, felt deafeningly loud. It was during this desperate crawl hours later that Cale heard it. Not the rasping of the Nosferatu, but the solid metallic clang of Vorthosian armored boots. Someone was in the escape duct, coming towards him. Cale froze. Was it an Alara-ordered rescue? Or Zaratha's spies, waiting to intercept him and claim his information, or his life, for their own? At Outpost Obsidian, the mood in the command tent was thick with tension. Alara had not slept. She stood over the map, but her focus was strained, her patience worn thin. The second night was drawing to a close. Suddenly, the heavy leather flap of the tent was thrown aside, and Lord Zareth strode in, flanked by 4 of his personal guards, his silver armor glinting ominously in the lamplight. "My queen," Zareth boomed, his voice laced with false concern. "My scouts detected unusual movement near this area. I came immediately, concerned for your safety." Elara turned slowly, her face a mask of cold fury. "Your sudden concern is noted, General. You overstep your authority. This is my command center." "My loyalty compels me, Your Majesty," Zareth insisted, his eyes sweeping across the tent, clearly searching for Kale. "But I confess my concern is twofold. Rumors have reached the citadel of strange activities here. The human consort's sudden disappearance into the wilderness has caused speculation. Some whispers suggest he may be acting as a traitor, feeding information to the remaining human rebels." He paused, letting the accusation hang in the cold air. "If he has betrayed us, my queen, your strategic security is compromised. We must find him and interrogate him before the third night ends and the time for our decisive action is lost." Elara knew Zareth wasn't concerned for Vorthos. He was attempting to either seize Kale's intelligence or use Kale's failure to force her hand into a direct, and potentially ruinous, confrontation with the Nosferatu. "The consort is on a mission of vital importance to Vorthos," Elara said, her voice like cracking ice. "And his loyalty is guaranteed by the treaty, a guarantee you seem eager to destroy, General. You will wait at the perimeter until his return." Zareth's smile was triumphant. "I will wait, my queen. But if he does not return, the Council will demand immediate military action. And they will expect my leadership to deliver it." Elara felt the noose tightening. Zareth was giving her a political ultimatum. Kale or war. The third night was already upon them. If Kale didn't return soon, she would be forced to choose between sacrificing her throne and betraying the fragile peace. In the suffocating dark of the tunnel, Kale heard the metal on rock sound again. It was closer now. He pressed his back into a crevice, the cold seeping through his tunic. He had to know who it was. He waited until the figure was right beside him, and then, using the last of his strength, he grabbed the boot of the figure, pulling them to a halt. "Who are you?" Kale whispered, his voice hoarse, ready to fight for the journal hidden beneath his clothing. The armored figure paused, then spoke, not with the deep growl of a general, but the measured, strong tone of one of Elara's guards. "Consort Rider?" "It is Varan," the guard whispered. "The Queen sent us. The third night has begun. She is worried." Varan's hand reached out, not to arrest him, but to guide him. Kale felt a wave of dizzying relief. Elara had extended the limit, risking her own rule to save him and his intelligence. She had risked everything on his fragile human life. "The black pool is real," Kale gasped, pushing himself forward, the oilskin-wrapped journal the most precious thing in the world. "Zareth is at the outpost. We must hurry." The longest night was not yet over, but Kale was no longer alone in the dark. Kale and Varan, Elara's loyal guard, emerged from the slave ducts into the supply caves of Outpost Obsidian just as the third night was beginning to fade into the bleak Vorthosian twilight. Kale was a wreck, soaked, shivering, exhausted, but his eyes burned with a fierce, singular focus. The oilskin-wrapped journal was clutched tightly against his chest. Varan immediately ushered Kale toward the command tent. "The Queen has been waiting, consort. And Lord Zareth has been pressing her for a decision." They entered the command tent. The atmosphere was a powder keg. Elara stood rigidly over the map table, her crimson eyes cold and exhausted. Facing her, his posture aggressive and triumphant, was Lord Zareth, flanked by his guards. Zareth was speaking as Kale walked in. "And therefore, Your Majesty, the consort's failure to return is proof of his treachery. We must seize command and launch the frontal assault now before the human rebels." Zareth stopped mid-sentence, his jaw dropping as he turned and saw the mud-caked, half-drowned figure of Kale Ryder standing in the tent entrance. Kale's unexpected appearance was a physical shockwave. Elara's own composure fractured for a fraction of a second, a flash of profound relief crossing her features, before she immediately locked down her regal mask. "Consort Rider," Elara's voice was sharp, a whiplash of command. "You are late. Report." Kale ignored his exhaustion, walking straight toward the map table. His presence was a silent refutation of Zareth's treason charge. "The consort is a traitor, Majesty," Zareth roared, recovering and lunging forward. "He has returned only to bring the enemy with him. Seize him." "Stand down, Zareth." Elara's voice thundered, a pure Vorta command that shook the tent. Her power was absolute. "He reports to me. Any vampire who interferes will face the Queen's justice for insurrection." Zareth froze, his hatred radiating from him like heat, but he obeyed. Kale placed the still damp, heavy journal on the map table and unwrapped the oilskin. He opened it to the hastily drawn sketches of the Blackpool gathering. Your Majesty, Kale began, his voice hoarse but steady. The Nosferatu threat is not a raid, it is an imminent, existential invasion. They are not hiding in the mountains. They are massed at the Blackpool. He pointed to the drawing of the immense, crowded cavern. I estimate between 3,000 and 4,000 combatants, far exceeding the number the Council believes. And they are led by a powerful, ancient general. They are preparing to breach the surface through the old Blackpool drainages, not to attack the western frontier, but to march directly on the citadel itself. Ilara leaned over the sketches, her eyes scanning the meticulous details Kale had risked his life to capture. The numbers, the formations, the distinct figure of the Nosferatu leader, it was overwhelming, undeniable truth. This is impossible. Zareth shouted, furious with desperation. The Blackpool is sealed. This is a human fabrication. A desperate lie to prevent me from saving Vorthos. Kale turned slowly to face Zareth, his eyes burning with the memory of the cold water and the fear in the dark. Lord Zareth, Kale said, his voice quiet, devastatingly controlled. You spent days searching the western frontier's high passes, demanding a frontal assault that would have sent Vorthos' forces straight into a costly distraction. I spent the last 2 nights crawling through the tunnels beneath your feet. Your plan would have left the citadel undefended. Kale looked back at Ilara. This information gives us the advantage, Your Majesty. We can bypass a disastrous ground war and use arcane tunneling explosives to collapse the Blackpool cavern directly onto the assembled Nosferatu forces. Ilara straightened, her face alight with strategic triumph. She looked at Kale, her gaze carrying a new, profound level of respect. He had not only brought the intelligence, he had brought the solution. She turned to Zareth, her voice now cold and final, the tone of a judge delivering a death sentence. General Zareth, Ilara commanded. Your continued refusal to acknowledge verifiable intelligence, your attempts to override my command, and your blatant manipulation of the Council's fear make you a liability to Vorthos. Your actions directly endangered the kingdom's security. Zareth's face drained of blood. My queen. I was only protecting. You were protecting your own ambition, Ilara cut him off. She did not execute him immediately, she administered a far worse punishment, political annihilation. Varon. Lyra. Escort Lord Zareth back to the citadel. He is stripped of his rank, his title, and his command over all legions. He will await my judgment in the deepest dungeons. He will see the results of the war he almost lost before he dies. Zareth looked at Kale one last time, his eyes burning with a silent vow of eternal vengeance, before Ilara's loyal guards dragged him out of the tent. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the political storm Kale had weathered. Ilara walked around the table to stand beside Kale. She picked up the journal, carefully examining the details once more. You have saved the kingdom, consort, she said, her voice low. And you have secured your place at my side. The political war is over. Now we prepare for the real one. She looked at him, truly seeing the exhaustion and the courage in his eyes. Without a word, she led him to a small, private cot tucked away in the tent. Rest, she ordered, her voice softened with an unfamiliar concern. You are mortal. I need you awake and sharp when we plan the final strike. Kale sank onto the rough fabric, suddenly overcome. He was safe. He had won. And for the first time in the cold heart of Vorthos, he felt a strange, fierce loyalty to the Warbride who had gambled her throne on his human life. Kale slept for a mere 4 hours, a deep, dreamless rest that only exhaustion could grant. He awoke to find the command tent quieter, the chaos replaced by focused activity. The sun had long since set, and the permanent night of Vorthos reigned outside. He sat up. Ilara was at the map table, not in armor, but wearing a simple high-necked dress of dark emerald velvet. She was surrounded by 4 of her most trusted arcane mages and tunneling engineers, pale, serious individuals who spoke in low technical whispers. Ilara noticed his movement. She dismissed the engineers with a curt gesture. They bowed low to her and, surprisingly, gave Kale a respectful, if curious, nod before exiting. You look less like a drowned rat, consort, Ilara observed, her tone dry. I feel like a man resurrected, Your Majesty, Kale replied, standing and stretching his stiff muscles. What is the status? Are we moving forward with the Blackpool plan? We are, Ilara confirmed, her crimson eyes fixed on the Blackpool marker on the map. My engineers have confirmed the structural integrity of the cavern system. We can use concentrated detonation runes, Vorta-level destructive power, to collapse the entire dome. We will bury the Nosferatu army beneath the earth. And the risk of destabilizing the entire region? Kale asked, his strategist's mind overriding his fear. Hi, Ilara admitted, walking over to him. The emerald of her dress was a startling contrast to her pale skin and dark hair. The political risk is higher. If this fails, the council will demand my abdication. But the alternative is the fall of Vorthos. It is an acceptable risk. She stood close, the scent of expensive, dark perfume and cold, mountain air surrounding her. I need your final tactical guidance, Kale Ryder. The Nosferatu general is ancient. He will not keep his forces massed for long. We need to strike within 2 nights. They spent the next 3 hours locked in intense, private planning. Kale, with his human understanding of tunnel dynamics and military distraction, pointed out the critical flaw in the Vorthosian plan, the placement of the detonators. You plan to place them at the visible junction points, Kale said, tracing the map. But the Nosferatu will have wards and sentries there. The general knows the Vorta use brute force. You need a distraction. You need to create a false point of collapse to draw the general's attention, while a smaller, highly mobile team places the main charges at the unstable stress points I identified in the old slave ducts, the routes the Nosferatu will ignore. Ilara's eyes never left his face. She listened, absorbed, and processed his every word. A false collapse, Ilara murmured. Misdirection. A human tactic. A survival tactic, Kale countered. It's not about strength but about outsmarting their primal instincts. The general will respond to perceived danger, not a calculated siege. The plan was refined, complicated, and entirely dependent on Kale's intimate generational knowledge of the ancient tunnels. As the planning reached its conclusion, a heavy silence fell over the tent. Ilara poured 2 small glasses of the deep crimson liquid. This time she didn't offer the fortified human drink. This is the crimson wine, she stated. Vorthosian tradition. Used to seal a pact of mutual devotion or a pact of war. Drink, consort. We are entering a phase where my life and the fate of Vorthos depends entirely on your mind. Kale took the glass. The liquid was thick, smelling powerfully of spices and ancient vintages, and a faint, metallic undertone that suggested real blood. He knew the risk. Drinking a Vorta-packed wine was a profound, dangerous step. He looked into her eyes. The coldness was gone, replaced by a fierce intensity that mirrored his own desperate loyalty to the peace he was fighting to secure. To the success of the mission, Your Majesty, Kale toasted quietly. To our mutual survival, consort, Ilara countered, her voice husky. They drank. The liquid was warm, spreading a strange, intoxicating heat through Kale's body. It was a terrifying, beautiful moment of shared vulnerability. Ilara placed her empty glass down. The attack team will be ready tomorrow night. You will accompany them, Kale. You will guide them through the slave ducts. Your utility is too great to leave at the outpost. Kale nodded. He expected nothing less. Ilara then reached out and gently traced the line of exhaustion under his eye, her touch incredibly cold against his warming skin. You are exhausted, Kale, she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register. And you have saved my life twice. You are my greatest discovery. But tell me this one thing before the final battle. Why truly do you fight so hard for the nation that conquered yours? Why risk yourself for me? Kale looked into the deepest recesses of her crimson eyes, seeing past the queen, past the Warbride, to the lonely, fierce woman who held the fate of 2 nations. Because the war is done, Ilara, Kale confessed, using her name naturally, intimately. And the one who fights for peace, even in the heart of darkness, is more honorable than the one who fights for eternal war. My people need that peace. And I need to know that this desperate sacrifice, my life, my soul, was not in vain. He paused, leaning slightly closer. And because, perhaps, I see a glimmer of something more than just a queen in the Warbride who trusts a human with her greatest secret. Ilara's breath hitched, a silent, mortal reaction. For a fleeting moment, Kale thought he saw her ancient, formidable guard break entirely. Rest, consort, Ilara commanded, her voice suddenly rough as she pulled away abruptly, the moment of shared intimacy shattered by the fear of what they had admitted. Tomorrow night, we destroy the enemy. The final night of the current campaign was cold, quiet, and heavy with the promise of carnage. Kale, though still physically recovering, felt a chilling clarity. He stood at the head of a small elite strike team, Varan and Lyra, Ilara's most trusted guards, 4 Vorta arcane mages carrying the destructive detonation runes, and Ilara herself, once again clad in her obsidian battle armor, her presence a silent, terrifying anchor. Remember the plan, Ilara commanded, her voice low. Varan and Lyra will create the false collapse distraction at the main tunnel entrance. The mages, guided by the consort, will plant the primary charges at the 3 stress points. Failure is not an option. If the charges are not set correctly, the detonation will simply crack the dome, not collapse it. Kale looked at Alara, a silent vow passing between them. He was not just a guide, he was the key. They entered the slave ducts, this time moving with a desperate haste. Kale led the way, relying entirely on the memory of his harrowing journey. The cramped, dark passages felt less terrifying now that he was surrounded by power, yet the responsibility weighed more heavily than ever. They moved for hours, the only sounds the scraping of metal, the soft clink of the runes, and Kale's labored breathing. Finally, Kale stopped, holding up a hand. They had reached the narrow aperture overlooking the Blackpool cavern. "This is the first planting site," Kale whispered to the leading mage. "The stress point is just below the passage. We need to go in single file." As the first mage started to squeeze through, a new sound echoed from the depths of the cavern below. A loud, rhythmic chanting. Alara's eyes narrowed. They are performing a ritual. They are preparing for their advance. We are running out of time. The 3 detonation runes were planted successfully at the predetermined points, their intricate carvings glowing faintly green. Kale, exhausted and paranoid, kept his eyes peeled for the patrols he knew were nearby. As they withdrew from the final planting site, they ran straight into a Nosferatu patrol. The ambush was sudden and brutal. The patrol was led by a creature larger and more agile than the others, and he immediately focused on the weakest link, the human. "The consort," the creature shrieked, its voice a horrific, broken rasp. "Seize the consort. The Warbride's pet." Kale was shoved aside as Alara immediately stepped between him and the attack. Her sword was a dark blur, engaging the larger creature. Varan and Lyra protected the mages. "Go. Activate the distraction." Alara roared to her guards, locked in combat. "Kale, get back to the detonation point. I will hold them." Kale knew he had a final, vital role. He sprinted back through the narrow ducts towards the main tunnel entrance where the false charge was set. He emerged near the primary Vorthosian tunnel entrance, just as Varan and Lyra were setting the final charge for the distraction. "Consort Rider," Varan yelled. "The general is waiting." He sensed the runes. Sure enough, standing in the mouth of the main Vorthosian tunnel, not far from the false charge, was the towering robed figure Kale had sketched, the Nosferatu general. He was surrounded by a massive retinue, his presence radiating in ancient, cold power. The general looked up, his pale eyes instantly locking onto the fragile human running towards the charge. "The consort," the general's voice boomed, deep and resonant. "You led them here, little mortal. You betray your own kind." "I betrayed no one," Kale yelled, skidding to a halt near the lever that would detonate the false charge. "I fought for peace. You only offer endless darkness." The general raised his staff, a surge of dark energy pooling at its tip, aimed directly at Kale. "Varan. Now!" Kale screamed. Varan slammed the lever. The false charge detonated with a deafening roar. Rock and dust rained down at the general's end of the tunnel, convincing the general that the Vorthosians were attempting to cave in the main entrance. The general hesitated, his attack on Kale forgotten. He roared a command to his troops and turned to assess the damage to the main tunnel, taking the bait perfectly. "Now, Kale?" Lyra yelled, pointing to the primary detonation trigger hidden near the tunnel exit. Kale knew this was his moment. He ran, dodging the falling debris, and slammed his hand onto the final, powerful lever. Deep beneath the earth, the concentrated Vorta runes exploded precisely at the 3 structural stress points identified by Kale. The resulting seismic shock was catastrophic. The entire Blackpool cavern, the vast ancient staging ground of the Nosferatu army, began to shake, then groan, and finally, with a horrifying, earth-splitting sound, it collapsed. Thousands of years of rock and earth fell inward, burying the entire Nosferatu advance force and their ancient general beneath an irreversible tomb. Kale, Varan, and Lyra barely made it out of the crumbling slave ducts before the ground settled into a final, heavy silence. They found Alara waiting, her armor bloodied, standing over the defeated remains of the patrol she had engaged. She looked at Kale, her armor steaming in the cold air. "Is it done, consort?" she asked, her voice raspy with exhaustion and effort. Kale, his body shaking uncontrollably, simply nodded. "The Blackpool is sealed. The Nosferatu are buried. Vorthos is safe." Alara walked to him. She did not praise his courage or thank him for his strategic brilliance. She simply reached up and, with a finality that brooked no debate, ripped the dagger Kale carried from his belt and threw it into the dark fissure where the collapse had happened. "The war is over, Kale Rider," she said, her voice now a low, intimate command. You are no longer the strategic asset, the shield, or the weapon. You are simply mine. Kale looked into her eyes, seeing the war-weary queen replaced by the intense, possessive woman who had sealed her fate with his. The price of peace had been paid. The Warbride had won the war, but in doing so, she had finally surrendered a piece of her crimson heart to the fragile human who saved her. The journey back to Vorthos was a stark contrast to the desperate, tense march outward. The news of the Blackpool's collapse and the annihilation of the Nosferatu army had traveled faster than their armored coach. The mood among the Vorthosian escorts was triumphant, almost religious. Ilara had not just won a battle, she had eradicated an ancient shadow that threatened the very foundation of their kingdom. Kale sat across from Ilara, the atmosphere inside the carriage changed forever. The cold, strategic distance was replaced by a strange, heavy intimacy. Ilara had kept her armor on for the return journey, but beneath the obsidian plates, Kale knew a shift had occurred. She occasionally glanced at him, her crimson eyes holding a depth of thought she hadn't allowed before. The Blood Council will be waiting, Ilara stated, breaking the silence as the first jagged spires of the citadel came into view. They will applaud the victory, but they will question the architect. Zaratha's remaining loyalists will try to frame your involvement as dangerous recklessness. They will ask why a human was given the critical role, Kale finished, adjusting the heavy, unfamiliar mantle Ilara had ordered for him, a garment signifying his new, undefined rank. And why their queen risked her life based on Immortal's history books. Ilara nodded. They will fear your influence, but they cannot deny the result. You will stand beside me, Kale. You will not be silent. You will be my voice of strategy. And if they ask about Torvin, the gardener? Kale asked, his voice low. The staged murder was the secret that still bound them by a thread of collective guilt. Ilara's eyes hardened. Torvin is dead. He was an unfortunate casualty of Zaratha's treachery, an attempt to lure you into a compromising position. That is the truth we maintain. The political cost of confessing that lie is too high. Kale looked away, the weight of the lie settling on him. He had saved a kingdom, but the cost was his honesty. The entrance to the citadel was a dazzling, brutal spectacle. Hundreds of high-ranking vampires, lords, generals, mages, and members of the Blood Council were assembled in the grand courtyard. The atmosphere was one of calculated celebration, but beneath the applause, Kale felt the sharp, assessing glares of his new enemies. Ilara descended from the carriage first, a magnificent figure of absolute authority. The cheers that greeted her were deafening. She walked with relentless purpose to the center of the court, where the elder of the council, an ancient, shriveled vampire named Lord Malphas, waited. Then came Kale. The moment the vampires saw the human consort follow the queen, dressed in robes of command, the cheers died instantly. A profound, chilling silence replaced the roar of the crowd. Kale felt every eye dissecting him, measuring his worth, his power, and his audacity. Ilara stopped before Lord Malphas, but she reached back and placed her pale, gauntlet hand firmly on Kale's shoulder. It was a clear, unmistakable declaration of ownership and partnership. The campaign is concluded, Ilara announced, her voice ringing across the court. The ancient enemy, the Nosferatu, are defeated, entombed beneath the earth, and the stability of Vorthos is secured. Lord Malphas bowed low, his voice a dry rasp. A profound victory, Your Majesty. Vorthos honors your strength. But the council requires a detailed account of this strategy. We hear alarming whispers that this victory was reliant on unconventional methods. The whispers are the sound of fear, Malphas, Ilara countered smoothly. The strategy was indeed unconventional. It was precise, intelligent, and focused on the structural weaknesses of the land. She tightened her grip on Kale's shoulder, forcing the court to look at him. The details were provided by my consort, Kale Ryder, who used his unique human knowledge of the region's ancient history to identify the Blackpool as the enemy's staging ground. He then personally guided the strike team for the final, critical deployment. A collective, furious murmur swept through the assembled vampires. Lord Cashin, a known ally of the now-imprisoned Zarath, stepped forward, his face contorted in disgust. The Queen credits a mere mortal? One whose loyalty is questionable? Lord Zarath, who fought on that border for centuries, warned against this human's rash advice. Lord Zarath is in the dungeons for his short-sightedness and insubordination, Ilara stated, her voice ice-cold. Had I followed Zaratha's counsel, Vorthos would now be fighting a disastrous ground war while the enemy marched on the citadel. The proof is in the silence of the Blackpool and the continued safety of our kingdom. Ilara looked directly at Cashin, her crimson eyes blazing. Kale Ryder is no longer merely the consort of peace. He is the architect of Vorthos's victory. Any vampire who questions his value questions my judgment, and thus questions the future of this kingdom. Kale stood tall under the weight of her declaration, feeling the thrill of shared victory and the stark terror of his new, elevated position. He was now officially a power broker in a society that loathed him. Later that night, back in the obsidian chambers, Kale found his suite dramatically upgraded. His simple robes were replaced by fine silk garments, and a small antique desk with fine human paper and ink had been installed. He was no longer a captive. He was a valuable asset. The stone wall slid open. Elara entered, wearing a simple, flowing black silk robe. She looked less regal but more imposing in her exhaustion. "You handled the council well," she conceded, pouring herself a cup of water from a silver pitcher. "Your protection was absolute, Your Majesty," Kale replied, sitting on the edge of the enormous bed. Elara walked over and stood before him. "The political battle has just begun, Kale. The council will attempt to seduce you, to discredit you, or to eliminate you in secret. Your survival depends on your proximity to me." She looked at him, her voice dropping to that husky, intimate register Kale had only heard in the field. "You are my weapon, my shield, and my most trusted mind. I will not lose you to their petty politics." She reached out and pulled Kale to his feet, closing the distance between them. "The Warbride requires her consort, Kale Ryder. The price of this victory is that we now belong to each other, absolutely." The weight of the crown, the war, and the mutual secrets had finally broken down the barriers. Their kiss was cold and fierce, a sealing of a pact forged in blood and conspiracy. The war for Vorthos was won, but the war for their survival and their hearts was just beginning. Kale's life in the Citadel transformed overnight. He was no longer confined to his suite. He was the Queen's advisor on mortal affairs, a title that sounded diplomatic but carried the weight of military command. He was granted access to the Citadel's libraries, map rooms, and even the guarded Vorta archives on border defense. His days were a blur of meetings, advising minor generals on restructuring the western frontier defenses, reviewing Lord Cashin's suspicious budget proposals, and working with the arcane mages to refine the Nosferatu attack assessment. Kale's every decision was watched, scrutinized, and often met with thinly veiled contempt by the older vampire nobility. His political survival hinged entirely on his continued proximity to Elara. Their partnership was now defined by the long late-night hours spent alone in the command chambers of the Citadel's tallest spire. These sessions were ostensibly for strategic planning, but they quickly became the most intimate parts of Kale's existence. One evening, Kale was detailing a plan to stabilize the western frontier's economy by using Viridian trade routes. Elara, dressed in a loose, black tunic, sat beside him, watching his hand move across the map. "Your insight into the human need for profit is fascinating," Elara murmured, her voice close. "Vorthosians are driven by power and order. You speak of trade, stability, and mutual benefit." "Vorthos has won the war, Your Majesty," Kale said, looking up at her. "Now it must win the peace. That requires building a bridge, not a wall." Elara's pale fingers brushed the map. "Bridges can be easily burned, consort. And walls, though costly, last forever." She leaned in, her cold breath on his ear. "But I find myself increasingly interested in the risk of your bridge." The map, the strategy, and the kingdom's fate were all temporarily forgotten. Their moments of passion were not soft or tender. They were fierce and desperate, a mutual release of the immense pressure and isolation they both faced. In those stolen hours, Elara shed the weight of the crown, and Kale forgot the fear of his mortality. Despite the political security in his new role, Kale felt a constant, prickling anxiety. He knew Lord Zareth was too ambitious and too powerful to simply rot in the dungeon. One morning, Kale was working in the main strategy archives, reviewing Zareth's old campaign logs, when he noticed an anomaly. A logbook detailing the Citadel's security protocols for the lowest dungeons, protocols that should have been sealed under Elara's direct order, was missing its final 3 pages. The paper was clearly torn, not cut. Kale's blood ran cold. He immediately sought out Varan, Elara's loyal guard. "Varan," Kale kept his voice low. "The final pages of the dungeon security log. They're gone." Was the log officially updated after Zareth's incarceration? Varan, usually unflappable, looked genuinely concerned. "No, consort. The logs were sealed and placed in the Black Vault. I personally oversaw it. If pages are missing, it means someone gained access to the Black Vault after Zareth was imprisoned. Only the Queen or the Elder Malphas hold the primary keys." Kale felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The threat wasn't just Zareth's escape, it was Zareth's network. The general had allies, and they were actively working to undermine Elara's authority from within the Citadel itself. Kale returned to the spire, his focus shattered. He found Ilara not in the main chambers but in her private study, a small, dark room dominated by a single floor-to-ceiling mirror framed in carved obsidian. "Your Majesty," Kale began, his voice urgent. "I found something concerning in the archives. Pages from the dungeon security protocols are missing. I believe Zaratha's faction is preparing for a jailbreak." Ilara turned from the mirror, her expression unreadable. She walked to her desk, her movements slow and deliberate. "I am aware," she stated calmly. Kale stared at her. "You are aware? And you have done nothing?" "The missing pages contain the codes for the secondary perimeter wards. If Zarath escapes, he will unite his forces and challenge your rule immediately." Ilara lifted a small silver item from her desk, a simple antique locket. "Zaratha's escape is not a threat, Kale Ryder," Ilara said, her eyes meeting his. "It is a necessity." Kale was stunned into silence. "A necessity? But why?" "Because, consort, I have stripped Zarath of his rank, but not his support in the council," Ilara explained, a chilling strategy unfolding in her voice. "If I execute him in the dungeon, he becomes a martyr, and his loyalists, Kashan and Malphasa's faction, will revolt in the name of his honorable service. The civil war would begin now, and Vorthos would be unstable." She walked to Kale and rested her cold hand on his chest. "I must force Zarath to commit the ultimate act of treason, escape and insurrection. If he leads an army against me from the outside, his treason is undeniable, his followers are implicated, and I can crush him and his entire political network in a single stroke, preserving Vorthos's order." She leaned in, her crimson eyes blazing with dark calculation. "I know they have the codes. I am allowing the jailbreak. I am preparing the trap. But Zarath is cunning. He will expect the trap to be physical. He will not expect the trap to be strategic." Ilara's lips curved into a cold, fierce smile. "The key to Zaratha's destruction is not my army, Kale. It is your mind. I need to know where Zarath will go first. I need you to predict the mind of a vengeful vampire general who has lost everything. Our next move will determine the fate of my throne." Kale felt the weight of her command, and the dangerous thrill of their shared conspiracy. He was now fully immersed in the deadliest Game of Thrones, and his queen was the ruthless architect of the trap. The next 2 nights were spent in a state of hypervigilance, Ilara and Kale locked in the Citadel's highest strategy spire. The tension of the impending jailbreak fueled their planning, sharpening their minds against the backdrop of their deepening, forbidden bond. "Where will Zarath go first?" Ilara asked, her tone low and demanding. She stood over a map of Vorthos, tracing the major power centers. "He is disgraced. He needs immediate support to legitimize his rebellion." "He has 2 needs, legitimacy and power," Kale replied, leaning over the map. "He will not attack the Citadel directly, that's a fool's move. He needs to rally his base, which is built on the idea of Vorthosian military superiority and contempt for the human peace." Kale tapped 2 locations on the map. "First, he will go to the southern barracks," Kale stated with certainty. "That's where he was publicly humiliated in Chapter 5. His core loyalists are the low-ranking, hardline legionnaires there. He will use them to build a temporary army." "And the second location?" Ilara pressed, her eyes fixed on his. "The western frontier," Kale continued. "He will attempt to reopen the border to Viridia, provoking a new war. This achieves 2 things. It proves the human peace is a failure, and it forces your hand, Queen Ilara, to fight both him and the human forces simultaneously." Ilara nodded slowly. "His hatred for the treaty is his weakness. He is predictable." "No," Kale corrected, his eyes meeting hers. "His passion is his weakness. He is driven by rage, not cold strategy. And that rage will lead him directly to his first target, Torvin." Ilara looked up, startled. "The gardener? Why?" "Zarath believes I killed Torvin to prove my loyalty to Vorthos," Kale explained. "He knows that act was the final blow to his power. But the murder was staged. Zarath will need confirmation that the threat behind me, your true commitment to ruthlessness, is real. He won't trust the reports. He will try to find Torvin's body near the Moon Garden fountain." "He will find nothing," Ilara scoffed. "My mages scrubbed the area clean. The body is in the dungeons, the real dungeons where he will never look." "But he will spend critical time searching," Kale insisted. "That time is our advantage. We use his need for confirmation to buy us time to prepare the ultimate trap." Ilara leaned in, her cold palm resting on his cheek. "Brilliant, consort. We let him escape, we let him look for the gardener he thinks you killed, and we meet him where his betrayal can be the most public and undeniable, the southern barracks." The jailbreak was silent, clean, and entirely orchestrated by the Queen. Ilara's loyal guards, Varan and Lyra, reported a major security breach at the Black Vault where the log pages were stored, and a hasty escape from the deepest dungeons. Zareth was free. The political tension in the Citadel became thick enough to choke on. Lord Cashin and Elder Malthus publicly expressed their deepest concerns over the Queen's lax security, fully aware that Zareth's freedom was their key to overthrowing Ilara. That night, Ilara did not come to the strategy spire. Instead, she stood alone in her private chamber, staring into the obsidian mirror. Kale found her there, her armor replaced by a simple, flowing night dress, her eyes heavy with strain. "They believe I am panicked," Ilara murmured, not looking at him. "They believe I am hunting Zareth. Instead, I am waiting for him to assemble his forces." Kale walked to her, stepping behind her and placing his hands gently on her shoulders, offering comfort that was both personal and political. "He will waste time at the Moon Garden. He will find nothing and his paranoia will grow. He will rush to the barracks. And when he does," Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength, "he will find me. But I cannot fight him on my own terms. My legions will not fight their former general unless his treason is absolute." She turned in his arms, facing him. "I need one more act of betrayal from you, consort. I need to guarantee Zareth's full commitment to insurrection." Kale looked at her, ready for the next dangerous command. "What is it?" "I need you to publicly condemn Zareth as a coward who flees justice," Ilara whispered, her crimson eyes intense. "And then, I need you to leave the Citadel, Kale. I need you to lead a small supply caravan towards the western frontier. Zareth will see the vulnerable convoy, assume you are attempting to warn the humans, and will divert his forces to destroy you. He will commit his army to chasing a human, the ultimate act of military folly and treason." Kale understood. You would be the living bait. The most precious target to Ilara, used as a lure to draw Zareth into an undeniable, televised trap. "If I am captured," Kale said, the cold truth settling in his gut, "Zareth will not hesitate. He will not kill me quickly. I will not allow it," Ilara vowed fiercely, placing her hand on his cheek. "My best legion will be hidden, following your trail. If Zareth touches one hair on your head, they will strike. But you must leave the Citadel alone. It is the only way to make the trap look real." Kale nodded, accepting the terrifying price of their shared victory. "For the peace, your majesty. I will be your bait." Kale's departure from the Citadel was orchestrated with maximum public drama and minimum actual protection. Ilara's plan was simple. Convince Lord Zareth's network that Kale was fleeing to alert the human border garrisons, making him an irresistible target. Kale, now officially known as the Architect of Victory, made a brief, calculated public appearance in the courtyard, where he loudly condemned Zareth as a coward who had fled justice. Then, escorted by only 3 low-ranking, seemingly indifferent guards and a single supply wagon, he rode out toward the western frontier. The wagon contained no vital supplies, only crates filled with common stone, disguised to look like weaponry. Kale knew his true protection. Ilara's elite legion, led by Varan, was shadowing him, moving through the deep shadows of the Dragon's Tooth range, silent and unseen. The journey was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Kale played the part of the anxious, stressed advisor, constantly looking over his shoulder. The guards, secretly loyal to Ilara, maintained a convincing facade of incompetence, ensuring that any of Zareth's spies would report a weak, vulnerable convoy. 2 days later, they were deep in the foothills, the desolate, rocky terrain that Kale knew intimately from his youth. The air was cold, and the perpetual twilight of Vorthos created a sense of suffocating isolation. Kale was riding ahead of the wagon when the prearranged signal came. A single, dark feather, the calling sign of Zareth's former scout unit, dropped from the sky and landed at his feet. "They've taken the bait," Kale muttered to himself, his heart slamming against his ribs. He immediately turned his horse, giving the secret signal to the guards to execute the second phase, abandonment. "The road is getting rough," Kale announced, his voice tight with feigned fear. "I'll take the quickest path on horseback. You follow with the wagon. I must reach the nearest outpost." The guards, playing their part perfectly, barely argued. Kale urged his horse down a narrow, rocky ravine, a path impossible for the heavy supply wagon. He was now alone, exposed, and exactly where Ilara wanted him to be. Minutes later, Kale heard them, the distant, chilling sound of mounted vampires moving at speed, fueled by vengeance. He rode hard, his focus sharp. He was heading not toward any outpost, but toward the planned ambush site, a wide, flat basin known as the Talon's Claw, a perfect killing ground for a hidden legion. Kale knew he had to appear desperate, but not broken. He glanced behind him. There they were. Lord Zareth, on a huge, dark charger, led the pursuit. He was flanked by about 50 heavily armed vampire riders, a mix of his former loyalists and mercenaries. Zareth's face was a mask of pure, murderous rage, his silver armor now dusty and dented from his hasty escape. Zareth spotted Kale and let out a triumphant roar that echoed through the rocks. The human traitor. Stop him. I will drink his blood myself. Kale spurred his horse forward, adrenaline flooding his system. The distance between them was closing fast. He reached the edge of the Talon's claw basin and pulled his horse to a skidding halt. He dismounted, pulling the reins free, and smacked the horse's flank, sending the animal galloping away, the final sign of a fugitive abandoning hope. Kale stood alone in the center of the vast, bowl-shaped clearing. He was unarmed, save for a small, useless knife hidden in his boot. Zareth and his riders poured into the basin, surrounding Kale instantly. They were too focused on the prize to notice the unnatural stillness of the surrounding rocky peaks. Zareth stopped his charger a few feet from Kale, his eyes burning with a hatred that could melt steel. Kale rider, Zareth hissed, dismounting and drawing his enormous broadsword. The Queen's pet. You thought you could defeat me with a piece of paper and a lie about an old gardener? You humiliated me. You stole my honor. And now, you will pay for the folly of the Queen's peace. Kale stood his ground, meeting the general's furious gaze. You failed, Zareth, Kale said, his voice ringing with forced confidence. You fell for a false collapse and you fell for a rigged jailbreak. You are a fool who would sacrifice the peace to chase a human. The Queen gambled everything on your worthless life. Zareth spat, raising his sword high. When I send your head back to the citadel, she will be broken and I will seize the throne. The human consort is finished. He brought the sword down in a sweeping arc, aimed directly at Kale's throat. Kale knew this was the moment. He ducked, the wind of the blade rushing over his head. She gambled on the future, Zareth. Kale yelled, scrambling backward. And she knows your every move. She knew you would come here. Just as Zareth raised his sword for the final killing blow, a trumpet blast, a clean, commanding sound that spoke of discipline and loyalty, echoed from the surrounding peaks. Varan and Lyra, leading hundreds of Ilara's best legionnaires, rose simultaneously from the rocks, their armor dark against the shadows. They had been waiting, unseen, surrounding Zareth's forces completely. Zareth froze, his sword hanging inches from Kale's body. He had been expertly boxed in. A figure on a white warhorse rode down the central ridge, obsidian armor gleaming in the twilight. Queen Ilara herself. She stopped at the edge of the basin, looking down at the trapped general. General Zareth, Ilara's voice was calm, yet amplified with power. You fled the justice of my dungeon. You attacked a convoy under my protection. You led a legion of armed rebels against the crown. Your treason is complete and undeniable. Now you will receive the justice you sought to escape. The war for the throne was over. The Warbride had won, and the price had been one terrified human's life. Lord Zareth stood trapped in the Talon's claw basin, his rebellion stillborn. His face, contorted by fury and disbelief, was the picture of a general outsmarted by a human and betrayed by his own predictable rage. Queen Ilara. Zareth roared, his voice thick with a final desperate plea. This is a setup. You forced me to flee. I acted only to protect Vorthos from this human parasite. Ilara surveyed the scene from the ridge, her position of power absolute. Her gaze was cold, unmoving, and utterly lethal. Your rhetoric is tired, Zareth, Ilara stated. Your treason is not. You attacked a convoy under my protection, violating the first law of the Vorta Code. You attempted to start a civil war. You are no martyr, you are a criminal. She nodded to Varan, who immediately signaled the surrounding legions. Zareth's riders, seeing the overwhelming numbers and the Queen's uncompromising stance, dropped their weapons. They were beaten before the first blade was raised. Zareth, however, was not finished. He turned his eyes of fire from Ilara to Kale, who stood only a few feet away, covered in dust but resolute. Then I take the price of your folly, Warbride? Zareth screamed, launching a final, frenzied attack toward Kale. He knew he couldn't kill Ilara, but killing her precious consort would be his last act of vengeance. Kale saw the attack coming, but he was exhausted, slow, and unarmed. He braced for impact, knowing this was the end. But before Zareth's sword could travel half the distance, Ilara's form blurred. She descended the ridge with impossible speed, not on horseback but using her pure Vorta strength, and landed directly between Kale and the charging Zareth. The impact was bone-jarring. Ilara met Zareth's massive broadsword with her own, the clash of obsidian on silver ringing like a death knell. She deflected his blow, her armor absorbing the shock. Zareth, fueled by desperate rage, pressed his attack, but Ilara was cold, controlled power. The duel was swift and brutal. Ilara fought not with anger, but with the focused strategic precision Kale had come to know. She did not seek to wound, she sought to disarm and incapacitate. With a final, crushing blow, she sent Zaratha's broadsword spinning into the air, and then struck him hard in the head with the pommel of her own sword. Zarath collapsed, unconscious. Ilara stood over him, breathing heavily, the entire basin silent save for the ragged sound of Kale's gasping breaths. She looked down at Zarath, then turned slowly to Kale. She walked to him, her eyes scanning his body for any injury. Finding none, she placed her gauntlet hands on his cheeks, her cold touch a startling comfort. "You are safe," she whispered, a low, fierce statement that was meant only for him. She then straightened, turned to the assembled legions and raised her voice, making a declaration that would change Vorthos forever. "The traitor Lord Zarath is defeated. His rebellion is crushed and order is restored." She paused, then walked back to the center of the basin, standing over the unconscious general. "I have listened to the whispers of my council and the foolish advice of my former general. I have learned a costly lesson. Vorthos requires more than simple strength to survive. It requires vision and adaptability." Ilara looked directly at Kale, summoning him forward to stand beside her, in the literal shadow of her triumph. "This is Kale Ryder," Ilara declared, her voice ringing with indisputable authority. "He is the architect of our victory over the Nosferatu. He is the strategist who predicted Zaratha's every move. He is the voice of the new future of Vorthos." She reached out and dramatically removed the mantle of Consort of Peace from his shoulders, and replaced it with a heavy, obsidian cloak, the black velvet embroidered with subtle crimson Vorta runes, a garment of high command, not diplomacy. "Henceforth, Kale Ryder is no longer the mere Consort of Peace. By my decree, he is named the High Strategos of the Crown and first advisor to the Vorta Queen," Ilara pronounced. "His rank is second only to the Queen. His word is law, second only to mine. Any who challenge his authority challenge the crown itself. Let this be the vow of the Warbride. Vorthos will rule with both Vorta strength and mortal wisdom." The declaration was met with silence, followed by a slow, rumbling cheer from Ilara's loyal legionnaires, which quickly spread through the captured rebels, cementing Kale's new, untouchable position. Kale looked at Ilara, his queen, his partner, his fiercest protector. He was no longer a hostage. He was the de facto co-ruler of Vorthos, bound to her by a shared destiny and a profound, life-altering pact. The war was over, but the work of integrating a human mind into the heart of a vampire kingdom had just begun. The return to the Citadel was the most difficult journey Kale had ever undertaken. The victory over Zarath was absolute, yet the silence surrounding Ilara and Kale was heavier than any battle cry. Zaratha's remaining loyalists were cowed but not eliminated. The Blood Council had been humiliated by their former general's predictable failure and was now simmering with resentment toward the human whose intellect had exposed their lack of foresight. Kale walked into the Citadel not as a hostage or a consort, but as the High Strategos of the Crown. He wore the obsidian cloak proudly, but every step echoed with the weight of hatred directed at him. The first official event was the Vorta Council Assembly. The Grand Chamber was dark, lit by flickering arcane lights that emphasized the harsh, ancient faces of the vampire elders. Elder Malphas, the head of the council, sat at the head of the immense stone table, his gaze a dry, relentless form of judgment. Ilara stood before the council, recounting the treason of Zarath and the strategic genius that led to his defeat. Kale stood slightly behind and to the left of Ilara, a position usually reserved for the queen's spouse or heir. "The war against the Nosferatu and the civil disturbance of Zarath are concluded," Ilara announced. "Vorthos is safe, thanks to the vision of my High Strategos, Kale Ryder." Malphas cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding. "The victory is celebrated, Your Majesty. But the Council must address the precedent of this appointment. To place a mortal in a rank second only to the Queen violates every tenet of Vorta order. The bloodline is sacred." "The kingdom is more sacred," Ilara countered, her voice dangerously calm. "Kale Ryder proved that the Vorta focus on strength blinds us to strategy. He has earned his place through sacrifice and victory. Are you suggesting, Elder, that the ancient texts forbid survival?" Malphas shifted, unable to challenge Ilara's logic directly. "We require a display of Vorta faith from him, Your Majesty. Let the consort prove that his heart is aligned with the order." The challenge was not political, it was intensely personal and cultural. They were demanding Kale conform to their ancient rituals. The social tension was palpable not just in the council, but in the private chambers as well. Kale was still sleeping in his upgraded suite, while Ilara occupied her private wing. The political necessities of the Citadel demanded they maintain a semblance of professional distance in public, though their private bond was undeniable. That night, Kale was reviewing a complex border security report when the panel slid open. Ilara entered, wearing a stunning, ceremonial garment of deep crimson and black lace, a robe worn only for the most important Vorta rituals. Malphas's challenge is real, Ilara said, her eyes intense. They want a symbol of obedience. Tomorrow you will participate in the Vorta blood oath ceremony. Kale looked up, startled. The blood oath? That requires a Vorta life bond. I am mortal. It requires the willingness to bond, and the display of absolute commitment, Ilara explained, walking to him. It is meant to tie you irrevocably to the Vorta order, proving you value our survival over the whispers of your past. She sat on the desk beside him, the crimson fabric of her robe brushing his. But I will not bind you to the Vorta order, Kale. I will bind you to me. What does that mean, Ilara? He asked, using her first name, the shared intimacy the only source of warmth in the cold stone room. It means the ritual is ancient, but the meaning is personal, Ilara confessed, her voice dropping to a low whisper. When Malphas performs the ritual, he will attempt to bind your life force to the Vorta throne. You must internally reject that and focus your entire will on me. It will change the nature of the bond. She looked at him, her crimson eyes blazing with fierce honesty. I do not want you to be the Vorta's property. I want you to be mine. This ritual is my way of cementing our mutual sovereignty. It will be our greatest secret. Kale felt a chill run down his spine. This was a deeper, more profound gamble than the Blackpool mission. It wasn't just about politics. It was about the metaphysical reality of his soul. And the risk, Ilara? If you fail to focus, the ritual will consume your life force, binding you to the Citadel's stone, she warned him, her cold hand reaching out and cupping his cheek. But if you succeed, no vampire, not even the council, can question your loyalty or separate you from me. Ilara leaned in, her eyes locked on his. Choose your allegiance, High Strategos. Choose your heart. The next day, Kale stood in the center of the grand chamber, facing the assembled council. The arcane energy in the room was suffocating. Malphas began the ancient chant, his voice low and powerful, calling upon the Vorta ancestors to claim the consort's life force for the Citadel. As the chant reached its climax, Malphas raised a silver dagger, ready to draw the ritual blood. Kale closed his eyes, his mind focusing entirely on the one being in the room who truly accepted him. He visualized the cold touch, the fierce eyes, the weight of the crimson bond they had already forged. I am Vorta, the ritual demanded. I am Kale, he countered internally. I am hers. Malphas completed the ritual, drawing Kale's blood and allowing it to smoke on a piece of obsidian rock. The chamber shivered. When Kale opened his eyes, he felt a profound difference. His vision was clearer, his senses sharpened, and he felt a cold, sharp thread connecting his very being to Ilara. He had successfully deflected the council's claim and bound himself to the queen alone. Malphas stepped back, his face a mixture of confusion and mild frustration. The ritual was complete, but the power felt misdirected. The human soul is secured to the order, Malphas declared, his voice lacking certainty. The council is appeased. Ilara walked to Kale and took his hand. She looked directly into Malphas's confused eyes. The bond is sealed, Ilara stated, a triumphant smile briefly touching her lips. The High Strategos is mine. Now let us prepare for the next battle. The western frontier requires a new peace, not a new war. The cultural war had begun, and Kale had just chosen his side, not Vorthos, but the Warbride queen who needed his heart as much as his mind. The purpose of the current journey was a diplomatic mission to the former capital of Viridia, now a fortified Vorthosian outpost near the shared border. Ilara was going to formalize the new peace treaty terms, and Kale was going as the High Strategos, the visible face of human cooperation with Vorthos. This time, the travel coach was a luxurious, imposing carriage, a symbol of the new regime's confidence. Kale and Ilara sat side by side, mirroring their new co-ruler status. Your presence is vital, Ilara stated, adjusting the silver pin on Kale's obsidian cloak. You must show your former people that working with Vorthos is not servitude, but survival. They will see me as the ultimate traitor, Kale countered, his voice grim. I traded my sovereignty for my life, and now I arrive draped in the enemy's colors. They will hate me more than they hate you. Good, Ilara said, her eyes flashing. Their hatred for you will solidify their fear of my power. And fear, Kale, is the foundation of a lasting peace. When they arrived at the former Viridian capital, the scene was tense. The city was quiet, guarded by Vorthosian legionnaires. The only Viridian representative was Councillor Lyra, a distant relative of Kale's, and the highest-ranking human official still in power. She was known for her fiercely independent spirit and her deep sorrow over the loss of the kingdom. Kale and Alara descended from the carriage. The few assembled human citizens watched in chilling silence. Kale was acutely aware of the weight of the moment, the conqueror and the collaborator side by side. Counselor Lyra approached them. She was dressed in the traditional faded blue and silver of Viridia, a deliberate contrast to Kale's dark Vorta robes. She bowed stiffly to Alara, then stood straight, refusing to acknowledge Kale. "Welcome, Queen Alara." Lyra's voice was cold, sharp with grief. "We have prepared the hall for the treaty signing." Alara nodded imperiously. "Lead the way, counselor. And greet my high strategos, Kale Ryder." Lyra's eyes finally turned to Kale, and the expression she held was one of profound, utter contempt. It was a look that shattered Kale's carefully constructed defenses. "I greet Kale Ryder," Lyra said, her voice dripping with irony. "The man who traded his crown for a coat, and his people's honor for a queen's bed." Kale felt the sting of the public humiliation, but he held his composure, meeting her gaze with all the political strength he had gained. "I stand here to guarantee your future, counselor," Kale stated, his voice steady. "The war is over. I secured the peace." "You secured slavery, high strategos?" Lyra spat back, using his title like a curse. "You killed your own kind for the queen's favor. Do not forget Sergeant Elias, who died by your political hand. Your peace is built on blood and betrayal." Alara's eyes narrowed at the mention of Elias, but she remained silent, allowing Kale to fight his own battle. "Sergeant Elias was a deserter who failed his oath," Kale countered, twisting the lie they had fabricated for Torvin. "I chose the life of 1,000 over the life of one. Your continued defiance risks all." "My defiance proves we still have a soul, consort," Lyra finished, using the lower, discredited title. She then turned her back on him and led Alara toward the treaty hall. Kale stood alone for a moment, absorbing the hatred. The Vorta blood oath had secured his place in Vorthos, but it had irrevocably severed his last tie to humanity. The treaty negotiations were brutal, with Lyra fighting Kale point for point, using her knowledge of the human economy to challenge Vorthosian overreach. Kale, however, was prepared. He had anticipated every one of her moves, using his Vorta knowledge to protect Viridian interests. He was their enemy, but he was also the most effective defender they had. Late that night, after the negotiations had stalled, Kale found Alara in their shared chamber. "Lyra is strong," Alara admitted, unclasping her heavy belt. "She fights you as fiercely as Zareth did. You are effective, but this personal animosity is slowing the peace process." "She hates me because I betrayed the ideal of human resistance," Kale said, standing at the window, staring out at the silent, conquered city. Alara walked up behind him, her cold hands wrapping around his waist. "She hates the illusion of betrayal. You did not betray them, Kale. You saved them from extinction. You must make her see that." "How?" Kale asked, leaning back against her firm, armored body. "She sees the obsidian on my back, not the human in my heart. You must show her the consequences of continued warfare, not the rewards of peace," Alara whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "Lyra believes she has allies among the remaining human resistance groups. She is corresponding with the last pockets of rebels in the northern wastes." Kale turned in her arms, his eyes scanning hers. "How do you know?" "I know everything that happens in the conquered territories, high strategos," Alara said, a dark smile touching her lips. "This is my kingdom. Tomorrow, present Lyra with the evidence of her communication with the rebels. Offer her a choice: join the peace or face the consequences of treason." Kale felt a chill. This was the moment where he had to become truly ruthless, using his intimate knowledge of his own people against them. It was the final price of his commitment to Alara and the peace. "I will do it," Kale said, accepting the dark necessity. "I will break her defiance. For the peace." He looked at Alara, seeing the cold command in her eyes, but also the fierce, possessive need that bound them together. He was a creature of two worlds, accepted by neither, but desperately needed by the Warbride Queen of Vorthos. The final negotiation session was scheduled for the dead of night, Vorthosian style. But Kale decided to confront Counselor Lyra privately, an hour before the formal meeting. He found her alone in the small study allocated for the Viridian delegation, staring out at the grim, conquered city. She turned as Kale entered, her face hardening with contempt. "Have you come to boast of your queen's superiority, high strategos? Or perhaps to adjust my collar?" "I have come to offer you a choice, Lyra," Kale said, walking toward the desk. He placed a small, folded piece of parchment on the polished wood. It was a copy of the communication record Alara had given him. Lyra's encrypted messages with the rebel factions in the northern wastes. This is a record of your communication with the northern waste rebels, Kale stated, his voice flat. Your promise to supply them with resources and a coordinated uprising date. Lyra's composure shattered. She snatched the parchment, reading the damning evidence. Her eyes flashed with desperate fury and defeat. How dare you, Kale? You spy on your own blood. This is the Queen's filth. It is a reality, Lyra, Kale countered, his voice steady despite the raw pain of his actions. The reality is that Ilara knows everything. She is allowing you this rebellion just as she allowed Zareth his escape. She is waiting for the perfect moment to crush you all, secure in the knowledge that your resistance will justify the final brutal suppression of Viridia. He leaned across the desk, meeting her desperate gaze. The choice is simple. You can be the martyr, sacrificing the lives of every last rebel, your honor, and the safety of the civilians here. Or you can be the bridge. You can use your influence to bring those rebels to the negotiating table, secure their safety, and fight for their future from within. Fight from within? Lyra scoffed, tears of rage gathering in her eyes. You mean kneel in your Vorta cloak like you? You call this life? I call this survival. Kale roared, finally letting his own frustration show. I secured a future for your people by ensuring Vorthos' survival. I killed the Nosferatu to save your lives. I risked my soul in the blood oath to bind myself to the one person who could guarantee our continued existence. I am draped in obsidian, yes, but only because it is the strongest armor to protect your future. Kale took a shuddering breath, his voice softening with painful sincerity. Look at me, Lyra. I am a captive, a co-ruler, a pawn, and a strategist. But every piece of leverage I gained, every secret I kept, every lie I told, it was all to ensure that your children and the children of the Northern Wastes do not end up in the Black Pool. I am the traitor who secured the peace. I am the cost. He picked up the rebel communication document. The final negotiations are in an hour. When you walk into that room, you will not talk about war. You will talk about amnesty, provisions, and agricultural autonomy. You will leverage the threat of the rebels for concessions, knowing you can deliver them to the peace table. You will use your defiance for good, not for death. Lyra stared at the parchment, then at Kale's pleading, defeated face. She saw not the high-ranking Vorta official, but the idealistic young man who used to pore over ancient history books in the Viridian library. The sheer, overwhelming sacrifice he had made was undeniable. And if I refuse? Lyra whispered. Then I will present this parchment to Ilara myself, Kale said, his voice cold. And she will crush the northern wastes before dawn. She needs this peace, but she requires Vorthos' stability more. Don't force her hand, Lyra. Don't force mine. An hour later, Kale watched from his position beside Ilara as Counselor Lyra walked into the negotiation hall. She was pale, but her spine was straight. The negotiations began. Lyra didn't plead for concessions, she demanded them. She didn't speak of Viridian weakness, she spoke of the imminent threat of unpacified territory, and the need for Vorthos to buy long-term loyalty. She asked for full amnesty for all rebels who laid down arms within the next month and a substantial autonomy over Viridia's fertile plains. Ilara listened, her face unreadable, her eyes occasionally flicking to Kale. She knew this was the result of Kale's painful confrontation. The terms are demanding, Ilara finally said, her voice smooth. But the stability of the Western territories is paramount. The peace is granted. Amnesty is confirmed. Viridia will be granted agricultural autonomy, but Vorthosian military presence remains. Lyra had won a significant victory, a victory born from her initial defiance and Kale's painful betrayal. The treaty was signed. The long war was finally definitively over. Later that night, back in the Citadel, Kale sat alone in his chamber, the weight of the day, the blackmail, the betrayal, the final severing of his human identity, crushing him. The panel slid open. Ilara entered, silent and observant. She walked to him, placing a hand on his obsidian shoulder. You are a terrifying strategist, Kale Ryder, Ilara said, a hint of respect and pride in her voice. You saved your people from themselves. You are the architect of the final peace. I am a traitor, Ilara, Kale whispered, looking at the black cloak. Ilara knelt before him, a startling act of vulnerability for the Warbride queen. She reached up, her cold hand touching the clean skin beneath his collar. You are the crimson heart of Vorthos, Kale, Ilara corrected, her eyes blazing with fierce, possessive love. You are the one who bridged the dark and the light. You are the only person who can stand in two worlds and secure them both. You are mine and I am yours. She pulled him into a fierce, cold embrace. The war for the throne was over. The war for peace was won. And the unique, impossible bond between the Vorta Queen and her human strategos was forever sealed. 5 years had passed since the collapse of the Black Pool and the final defeat of Lord Zareth. The citadel no longer buzzed with the fearful whispers of political intrigue. It hummed with the slow, difficult work of integration and peace. The name Kael Rider was no longer a curse in Viridia, nor a scandal in Vorthos. He was the High Strategos, a formidable, necessary power. His policies, focused on fair trade, agricultural autonomy for the human territories, and shared defense against external threats, had brought a stability neither Vorthosian strength nor human rebellion could achieve. The peace was cold, but it was lasting. Kael stood on the highest spire of the citadel, his obsidian cloak moving in the chill air. He was no longer the frail human hostage. His body was lean, hardened by the constant pressure of command. He looked down at the sprawling, dark city. Tonight, the human delegations from Viridia were arriving for the annual Harvest Festival, a cultural exchange Kael had instituted, blending human tradition with Vorta formality. A pair of cold, strong arms wrapped around his waist from behind. Ilara rested her chin on his shoulder, her presence a silent, fierce anchor. She wore a simple, elegant black gown, her crimson eyes reflecting the lights of the city. "Your human festival is causing undue cheerfulness in the lower sectors," Ilara murmured, her voice laced with amusement. "Lord Malphas is apoplectic. He claims we are dissolving the sacred Vorta order. Tell Lord Malphas that the sacred order is now preserved by a stable economy and full supply chains," Kael replied, turning in her arms to face her. "He can complain to the budget committee." Ilara laughed, a rare musical sound that Kael cherished. "I love your contempt for their hierarchy, my strategos." Their bond was now a public accepted fact. The Vorta blood oath had permanently linked their destinies, and their efficiency as a ruling unit was undeniable. Ilara had become the queen who understood the long game, ruling with patience and strategy rather than just brute force. Kael had become the power who was fearless in the face of ancient authority, knowing his queen's loyalty was absolute. "Lyra's delegation is arriving tonight," Ilara reminded him, her gaze sharpening. "She still despises the Vorta, but she respects the peace." "She respects us," Kael corrected gently. "She knows the price we paid. She knows that every human concession we won was paid for with my constant vigilance." Ilara lifted her hand and touched Kael's cheek, the coldness of her skin still a familiar, grounding sensation. "Do you regret the price, Kael? Do you regret the trade?" Kael looked into her ancient, fiercely beautiful eyes. He had lost his former life, his people's initial respect and the comfort of warmth and sunlight. But he had gained a purpose greater than a kingdom, and a love deeper than any human could offer. "I regret nothing," Kael vowed, leaning in to kiss her, a kiss that was no longer desperate or fearful, but possessive and deep. "I am the crimson heart of Vorthos. I chose survival. I chose the future. And I chose you." "Then let us greet your guests, High Strategos," Ilara said, her eyes shining with triumph. "The Warbride and her human will show the two worlds how true partnership is defined." They walked hand in hand to the grand staircase, the vampire queen of Vorthos and her human co-ruler, ready to face the long, cold night of their shared, eternal future.